Book the Seventh, Part 2 of Birds of Prey by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2. Mrs. Sheldon Accepts Her Destiny. Miss Halliday had an interview with her mother that evening in Mrs. Sheldon's dressing room, while that lady was preparing for rest, with considerable elaboration of detail in the way of hair brushing, and putting away of neck ribbons and collars and trinkets in smart little boxes and handy little drawers, all more or less odorous from the presence of dainty satin-covered sachets. The sachets and the drawers and boxes and trinkets were Mrs. Sheldon's best anchorage in this world. Such things as these were the things that made life worth endurance for this poor, weak little woman, and they were more real to her than her daughter, because more easy to realize. The beautiful, light-hearted girl was a being whose existence had always been something of a problem for Georgina Sheldon. She loved her after her own feeble fashion, and would have jealously asserted her superiority over every other daughter in the universe, but the power to understand her or to sympathize with her had not been given to that narrow mind. The only way in which Mrs. Sheldon's affection showed itself was unquestioning indulgence and the bestowal of frivolous gifts, chosen with no special regard to Charlotte's requirements, but rather because they happened to catch Mrs. Sheldon's eye as they glittered or sparkled in the windows of Bayswater repositories. Mr. Sheldon happened to be dining out on this particular evening. He was a guest at a great city feast, to which some of the richest men upon 'Change had been bidden, so Miss Halliday had an excellent opportunity for making her confession. Poor Georgie was not a little startled by the avowal. "My darling Lotta," she screamed, "do you think your papa would ever consent to such a thing?" "I think my dear father would have consented to anything likely to secure my happiness, mamma," the girl answered sadly. She was thinking how different this crisis in her life would have seemed if the father she had loved so dearly had been spared to counsel her. "I was not thinking of my poor dead first husband," said Georgie. This numbering of her husbands was always unpleasant to Charlotte. It seemed such a very businesslike mode of description to be applied to the father she so deeply regretted. "I was thinking of your step-papa," continued Mrs. Sheldon. "He would never consent to your marrying Mr. Hawkehurst, who really seems to have nothing to recommend him, except his good looks and an obliging disposition with regard to orders for theatres. I am not bound to consult my stepfather's wishes. I only want to please you, mamma." "But, my dear, I cannot possibly consent to anything that Mr. Sheldon disapproves." "Oh, mamma, dear kind mamma, do have an opinion of your own for once in a way. I dare say Mr. Sheldon is the best possible judge of everything connected with the Stock Exchange and the money market. But don't let him choose a husband for me. Let me have your approval, mamma, and I care for no one else. I don't want to marry against your will, but I am sure you like Mr. Hawkehurst." Mrs. Sheldon shook her head despondingly. "It is all very well to like an agreeable young man as an occasional visitor," she said, "especially when most one's visitors are middle-aged city people. But it is a very different thing when one's only daughter talks of marrying him. I can't imagine what can have put such an idea as marriage into your head. It is only a few months since you came home from school, and I fancied that you would have stopped with me for years before you thought of settling." Miss Halliday made a wry face. "Dear mamma," she said, "I don't want to settle. That is what one's housemaid says, isn't it, when she talks of leaving service and marrying some young man from the baker's or the grocer's? Valentine and I are not in a hurry to be married. I am sure for my own part I don't care how long our engagement lasts. I only wish to be quite candid and truthful with you, mamma, and I thought it a kind of duty to tell you that he loves me, and that I love him very dearly." These last words were spoken with extreme shyness. Mrs. Sheldon laid down her hair-brushes while she contemplated her daughter's blushing face. Those blushes had become quite a chronic affection with Miss Halliday of late. "But good gracious me, Charlotte," she exclaimed, growing peevish in her sense of helplessness. "Who is to tell Mr. Sheldon?" "There is no necessity for Mr. Sheldon to be enlightened yet awhile, mamma. It is to you I owe duty and obedience, not to him. Pray keep my secret, kindest and most indulgent of mothers, and ask Valentine to come and see you now and then." "Ask him to come and see me, Charlotte? You must know very well that I never invite any one to dinner except at Mr. Sheldon's wish. I am sure I quite tremble at the idea of a dinner. There is such trouble about the waiting, and such dreadful uncertainty about the cooking. And if one has it all done by Birch's people, one cook gives warning next morning," added poor Georgy, with a dismal recollection of recent perplexities. "I am sure I often wish myself young again, in the dairy at Hyley Farm, making matrimony cakes for a tea party, with a ring and a fourpenny piece hidden in the middle. I'm sure the Hyley tea parties were pleasanter than Mr. Sheldon's dinners, with those solemn city people, who can't exist without clear turtle and red mullet. Ah, mother dear, our lives were altogether happier in those days. I delight in the Yorkshire tea parties and the matrimony cakes, and all the talk and laughter about the fourpenny piece and the ring. I remember getting the fourpenny piece at Newhall last year, and that means that one is to die an old maid, you know. And now I am engaged. As to the dinners, mamma, Mr. Sheldon may keep them all for himself and his city friends. Valentine is the last person in the world to care for clear turtle. If you will let him drop in sometimes of an afternoon, say once a week or so, when you and I and Diana are sitting at our work in the drawing-room, and if you will let him hand us our cups at our 5 o'clock tea, he will be the happiest of men. He adores tea. You will let him come, won't you, dear? Oh, mamma, I feel just like a servant who asks to be allowed to see her young man. Will you let my young man come to tea once in a way?" "Well, Charlotte, I'm sure I don't know," said Mrs. Sheldon, with increasing helplessness. "It's really a very dreadful position for me to be placed in. Quite appalling, is it not, mamma? But then I suppose it is a position that people afflicted with daughters must come to sooner or later. If it were the mere civility of asking him to tea," pursued poor Georgy, heedless of this flippant interruption, "I am sure I should be the last to make any objection. Indeed, I am under a kind of obligation to Mr. Hawkehurst, for his polite attention has enabled us to go to the theatres very often, when your papa would not have thought of buying tickets. But then you see, Lotta, the question in point is not his coming to our 5 o'clock tea, which seems really a perfect mockery to any one brought up in Yorkshire, but whether you are to be engaged to him. Dear mamma, that is not a question at all, for I am already engaged to him. But, Charlotte, I do not think I could bring myself to disobey you, dear mother," continued the girl tenderly. "And if you tell me of your own free will, and acting on your conviction, that I am not to marry him, I must bow my head to your decision, however hard it may seem. But one thing is quite certain, mamma. I have given my promise to Valentine, and if I do not marry him, I shall never marry at all. And then the dreadful augury of the fourpenny piece will be verified." Miss Halliday pronounced this determination with a decision of manner that quite overawed her mother. It had been the habit of Georgy's mind to make a feeble protest against all the mutations of life, but in the end to submit very quietly to the inevitable. And since Valentine Hawkehurst's acceptance of Charlotte's future husband seemed inevitable, she was fain to submit in this instance also. Valentine was allowed to call at the Lawn, and was received with a feeble, half plaintive graciousness by the lady of the house. He was invited to stop for the 5 o'clock tea, and availed himself rapturously of his delightful privilege. His instinct told him what gentle hand had made the meal so dainty and homelike, and for whose pleasure the phantasmal pieces of bread and butter usually supplied by the trim parlour-maid had given place to a salver loaded with innocent delicacies in the way of pound cake and apricot jam. Mr. Hawkehurst did his uttermost to deserve so much indulgence. He scoured London in search of free admissions for theatres, hunting ragamuffins and members of the Cyber Club, and other privileged creatures, at all their places of resort. He watched for the advent of novels adapted to Georgy's capacity, lively records of croquet and dressing and love-making, from smart young Amazons in the literary ranks, or deeply interesting romances of the sensation school, with at least 9 deaths in the 3 volumes, and a comic housemaid, or a contumacious Buttons to relieve the gloom by their playful waggeries. He read Tennyson or Owen Meredith, or carefully selected bits from the works of a younger and wilder bard, while the ladies worked industriously at their prie-dieu chairs, or Berlin brioches, or Shetland corvipieds, as the case might be. The patroness of a fancy fair would scarcely have smiled approvingly on the novel effects in crochet à tricoter produced by Miss Halliday during these pleasant lectures. "The rose will come wrong," she said piteously, "and Tennyson's poetry is so very absorbing." Mr. Hawkehurst showed himself to be possessed of honourable, not to say delicate, feelings in his new position. The Gothic villa was his paradise, and the gates had been freely opened to admit him whensoever he chose to come. Georgy was just the sort of person from whom people take ells after having asked for inches, and once having admitted Mr. Hawkehurst as a privileged guest, she would have found it very difficult to place any restriction upon the number of his visits. Happily for this much perplexed matron, Charlotte and her lover were strictly honourable. Mr. Hawkehurst never made his appearance at the villa more than once in the same week, though the once a week or so asked for by Charlotte might have been stretched to a wider significance. When Valentine obtained orders for the theatre, he sent them by post, scrupulously refraining from making the excuse for a visit. "That was all very well when I was a freebooter," he said to himself, "only admitted on sufferance, and liable to have the door shut in my face any morning. But I am trusted now, and I must prove myself worthy of my future mother-in-law's confidence. Once a week! 1/7 day of unspeakable happiness, bliss without alloy. The 6 other days are very long and dreary, but then they are only the lustreless setting in which that jewel the 7th shines so gloriously. Now if I were Waller, what verses I would sing about my love! Alas, I am only a commonplace young man, and can find no new words in which to tell the old sweet story." If the orders for stalls and private boxes were not allowed to serve as an excuse for visits, they at least necessitated the writing of letters, and no human being, except a lover, would have been able to understand why such long letters must needs be written about such a very small business. The letters secured replies, and when the order sent was for a box, Mr. Hawkehurst was generally invited to occupy a seat in it. Ah, what did it matter on those happy nights how hackneyed the plot of the play, how bald the dialogue, how indifferent the acting? It was all alike delightful for those 2 spectators, for a light that shone neither on earth nor sky brightened everything they looked on when they sat side by side. And during all these pleasant afternoons at the villa, or evenings at the theatre, Diana Paget had to sit by and witness the happiness which she had dreamed might some day be hers. It was a part of her duty to be present on these occasions, and she performed that duty punctiliously. She might have made excuses for absenting herself, but she was too proud to make any such excuses. "Am I such a coward as to tell a lie in order to avoid a little pain more or less? If I say I have a headache, and stay in my own room while he is here, will the afternoon seem any more pleasant or any shorter to me? The utmost difference would be the difference between a dull pain and a sharp pain, and I think the sharper agony is easier to bear." Having argued with herself thus, Miss Paget endured her weekly martyrdom with Spartan fortitude. "What have I lost?" she said to herself, as she stole a furtive glance now and then at the familiar face of her old companion. "What is this treasure, the loss of which makes me seem to myself such an abject wretch? Only the love of a man who is at his best is not worthy of this girl's pure affection, and at his worst must have been unworthy even of mine. But then at his worst he is dearer to me than the best man who ever lived upon this earth." Chapter 3. Mr. Hawkehurst and Mr. George Sheldon come to an understanding. There was no such thing as idleness for Valentine Hawkehurst during these happy days of his courtship. The world was his oyster, and that oyster was yet unopened. For some years he had been hacking and hewing the shell thereof with the sword of the freebooter, to very little advantageous effect. He now set himself seriously to work with the pickaxe of the steady growing labourer. He was a secessionist from the great army of adventurers. He wanted to enrol himself in the ranks of the respectable, the plodders, the ratepayers, the simple citizens who love their wives and children, and go to their parish church on Sundays. He had an incentive to steady industry, which had hitherto been wanting in his life. He was beloved, and any shame that came to him would be a still more bitter humiliation for the woman who loved him. He felt that the very first step in the difficult path of respectability would be a step that must separate him from Captain Paget. But just now separation from that gentleman seemed scarcely advisable. If there was any mischief in that Ullerton expedition, any collusion between the captain and the Reverend Goodge, it would assuredly be well for Valentine to continue a mode of life which enabled him to be tolerably well informed as to the movements of the slippery Horatio. In all the outside positions of life expedience must ever be the governing principle, and expedience forbade any immediate break with Captain Paget. "Whatever you do, keep your eye upon the captain," said George Sheldon, in one of many interviews all bearing upon the Haygarth succession. "If there's any underhand work going on between him and Philip, you must be uncommonly slow of perception if you can't ferret it out. I am very sorry you met Charlotte Halliday in the north, for of course Phil must have learned of your appearance in Yorkshire, and that will set him wondering at any rate, especially as he will no doubt have heard the Dorking story from Paget. He pretended he saw you leave town the day you went to Ullerton, but I'm half inclined to believe that was only a trap. I don't think Mr. Sheldon has heard of my appearance in Yorkshire yet." "Indeed. Miss Charlotte doesn't care to make a confidant of her stepfather, I suppose. Keep her in that mind, Hawkehurst. If you play your cards well, you ought to be able to get her to marry you on the quiet." "I don't think that would be possible. In fact, I'm sure Charlotte would not marry without her mother's consent," answered Valentine thoughtfully. "And of course that means my brother Philip's consent," exclaimed George Sheldon, with contemptuous impatience. "What a slow, bungling fellow you are, Hawkehurst! Here's an immense fortune waiting for you, and a pretty girl in love with you, and you dawdle and deliberate as if you're going to the dentist to have a tooth drawn. You've fallen into a position that any man in London might envy, and you don't seem to have the smallest capability of appreciating your good luck." "Well, perhaps I am rather slow to realize the idea of my good fortune," answered Valentine, still very thoughtfully. "You see, in the first place, I can't get over a shadowy kind of feeling with regard to that Haygarthian fortune. It is too far away from my grasp, too large, too much of the stuff that dreams and novels are made of. And in the second place, I love Miss Halliday so fondly and so truly that I don't like the notion of making my marriage with her any part of the bargain between you and me." Mr. Sheldon contemplated his confederate with unmitigated disdain. "Don't try that sort of thing with me, Hawkehurst," he said. "That sentimental dodge may answer very well with some men, but I'm about the last to be taken in by it. You are playing fast and loose with me, and you want to throw me over, as my brother Phil would throw me over, if he got the chance." "I'm not playing fast and loose with you," replied Valentine, too disdainful of Mr. Sheldon for indignation. "I have worked for you faithfully, and kept your secret honourably, when I had every temptation to reveal it. You drove your bargain with me, and I have performed my share of the bargain to the letter. But if you think I'm going to drive a bargain with you about my marriage with Miss Halliday, you are very much mistaken. That lady will marry me when she pleases, but she will not be entrapped into a clandestine marriage for your convenience." "Oh, that's your ultimatum, is it, Mr. Joseph Surface?" said the lawyer, biting his nails fiercely, and looking askant at his ally with angry eyes. "I wonder you don't wind up by saying that the man who could trade upon a virtuous woman's affection for the advancement of his fortune deserves to get it hot, as our modern slang has it. Then I am to understand that you decline to participate in matters." "I most certainly do." "And the Haygarth business is to remain in abeyance while Miss Halliday goes through the tedious formula of sentimental courtship?" "I suppose so." "That is unpleasant for me." "Why should you make the advancement of Miss Halliday's claims contingent on her marriage? Why not assert her rights at once?" "Because I will not trust my brother Philip. The day that you show me the certificate of your marriage with Charlotte Halliday is the day on which I shall make my first move in this business. I told you the other day that I would rather make a bargain with you than with my brother." "And what kind of bargain do you expect to make with me when Miss Halliday is my wife?" "I'll tell you, Valentine Hawkehurst," replied the lawyer, squaring his elbows upon his desk in his favourite attitude, and looking across the table at his coadjutor. "I like to be open and above board when I can, and I'll be plain with you in this matter. I want a clear half of John Haygarth's fortune, and I think that I've a very fair claim to that amount. The money can only be obtained by means of the documents in my possession, and but for me that money might have remained till doomsday unclaimed and unthought of by the descendant of Matthew Haygarth. Look at it which way you will, I think you will allow that my demand is a just one." "I don't say that it is unjust, though it certainly seems a little extortionate," replied Valentine. "However, if Charlotte were my wife, and were willing to cede half the fortune, I am not the man to dispute the amount of your reward. When the time comes for bargain driving, you will not find me a difficult person to deal with." "And when may I expect your marriage with Miss Halliday?" asked George Sheldon, rapping his hard finger nails upon the table with suppressed impatience. "Since you elect to conduct matters in the grand style, and must wait for mamma's consent and papa's consent, and goodness knows what else in the way of absurdity, I suppose the delay will be for an indefinite space of time." "I don't know about that. I'm not likely to put off the hour in which I shall call that dear girl my own. I asked her to be my wife before I knew she had the blood of Matthew Haygarth in her veins, and the knowledge of her claim to this fortune does not make her one whit the dearer to me, penniless adventurer as I am. If poetry were at all in your line, Mr. Sheldon, you might know that a man's love for a good woman is generally better than himself. He may be a knave and a scoundrel, and yet his love for that one perfect creature may be almost as pure and perfect as herself. That's a psychological mystery out of the way of Gray's Inn, isn't it?" "If you'll oblige me by talking common sense for about 5 minutes, you may devote your powerful intellect to the consideration of psychological mysteries for a month at a stretch," exclaimed the aggravated lawyer. "Oh, don't you see how I struggle to be hard-headed and practical?" cried Valentine. "But a man who is head over and ears in love finds it rather hard to bring all his ideas to the one infallible grindstone. You ask me when I am to marry Charlotte Halliday. To-morrow, if our fates smile upon us. Mrs. Sheldon knows of our engagement, and consents to it, but in some manner under protest. I am not to take my dear girl away from her mother for some time to come. The engagement is to be a long one. In the meantime I am working hard to gain some kind of position in literature, for I want to be sure of an income before I marry, without reference to John Haygarth, and I am a privileged guest at the villa." "But my brother Phil has been told nothing?" "Nothing as yet. My visits are paid while he is in the city, and as I often went to the villa before my engagement, he is not likely to suspect anything when he happens to hear my name mentioned as a visitor." "And do you really think he is in the dark, my brother Philip, who can turn a man's brains inside out in half an hour's conversation?" Mark my words, Valentine Hawkehurst, that man is only playing with you as a cat plays with a mouse. He used to see you and Charlotte together before you went to Yorkshire, and he must have seen the state of the case quite as plainly as I saw it. He has heard of your visits to the villa since your return, and has kept a close account of them, and made his own deductions, depend upon it. And some day, while you and pretty Miss Charlotte are enjoying your fool's paradise, he will pounce upon you as a puss pounces on poor Mousie." This was rather alarming, and Valentine felt that it was very likely to be correct. "Mr. Sheldon may play the part of puss as he pleases," he replied after a brief pause for deliberation. "This is a case in which he dare not show his claws. He has no authority to control Miss Halliday's actions." "Perhaps not, but he would find means for preventing her marriage if it was to his interest to do so. He is not your brother, you see, Mr. Hawkehurst, but he is mine, and I know a good deal about him. His interest may not be concerned in hindering his stepdaughter's marriage with a penniless scapegrace. He may possibly prefer such a bridegroom, as less likely to make himself obnoxious by putting awkward questions about poor Tom Halliday's money, every sixpence of which he means to keep, of course. If his cards are packed for that kind of marriage, he'll welcome you to his arms as a son-in-law, and give you his benediction as well as his stepdaughter. So I think if you can contrive to inform him of your engagement, without letting him know of your visit to Yorkshire, it might be a stroke of diplomacy. He might be glad to get rid of the girl, and might hasten on the marriage of his own volition." He might be glad to get rid of the girl. In the ears of Valentine Hawkehurst this sounded rank blasphemy. Could there be any one upon this earth, even a Sheldon, incapable of appreciating the privilege of that divine creature's presence? End of Book the Seventh, Part 2. Book the Seventh, Part 3 of Birds of Prey, by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4. Mr. Sheldon is propitious. It was not very long before Valentine Hawkehurst had reason to respect the wisdom of his legal patron. Within a few days of his interview with George Sheldon, he paid his weekly visit to the villa. Things were going very well with him, and life altogether seemed brighter than he had ever hoped to find it. He had set himself steadily to work to win some kind of position in literature. He devoted his days to diligent study in the reading room of the British Museum, his nights to writing for the magazines. His acquaintance with pressmen had stood him in good stead, and already he had secured the prompt acceptance of his work in more than one direction. The young litterateur of the present day has not such a very hard fight for a livelihood, if his pen has only a certain lightness and dash, a rattling vivacity and airy grace. It is only the marvellous boys who come to London with epic poems, Anglo-Saxon tragedies, or metaphysical treatises in their portmanteaus, who must needs perish in their prime, or stoop to the drudgery of office or counting-house. Valentine Hawkehurst had no vague yearnings after the fame of a Milton, no inner consciousness that he had been born to stamp out the footprints of Shakespeare on the sands of time, no unhealthy hungering after the gloomy grandeur of Byron. He had been brought up amongst people who treated literature as a trade as well as an art, and what art is not more or less a trade? He knew the state of the market, and what kind of goods were likely to go off briskly, and it was for the market he worked. When grey shirtings were in active demand, he set his loom for grey shirtings, and when the buyers clamoured for fancy goods, he made haste to produce that class of fabrics. In this he proved himself a very low-minded and ignominious creature, no doubt, but was not one Oliver Goldsmith glad to take any order which good Mr. Newberry might give him, only writing the Traveller and the story of Parson Primrose pour se distraire. Love lent wings to the young essayist's pen. It is to be feared that in roving among those shelves in Great Russell Street he showed himself something of a freebooter, taking his bien wherever it was to be found. But did not Molière frankly acknowledge the same practice? Mr. Hawkehurst wrote about anything and everything. His brain must needs be a gigantic storehouse of information, thought the respectful reader. He skipped from Pericles to Cromwell, from Cleopatra to Mary Stuart, from Sappho to Madame de Sablé, and he wrote of these departed spirits with such a charming impertinence, with such a delicious affectation of intimacy, that one would have thought he sat by Cleopatra as she melted her pearls, and stood amongst the audience of Pericles when he pronounced his funeral oration. With de Sablé and Chevreuse, Ninon and Marion, Maintenon and La Vallière, Anne of Austria, and the great Mademoiselle of France, he seemed to have lived in daily companionship, so amply did he expatiate upon the smallest details of their existences, so tenderly did he dwell on their vanished beauties, their unforgotten graces. The work was light and pleasant, and the monthly checks from the proprietors of a couple of rival periodicals promised to amount to the income which the adventurer had signed for as he trod the Yorkshire moorland. He had asked destiny to give him Charlotte Halliday and 300 a year, and lo, while yet the wish was new, both these blessings seemed within his grasp. It could scarcely be a matter for repining it the fates should choose to throw in an odd £50,000 or so. But was not all of this something too much of happiness for a man whose feet had trodden in evil ways? Were not the fates mocking this travel-stained wayfarer with bright glimpses of paradise, whose gates he was never to pass? This was the question which Valentine Hawkehurst was fain to ask himself sometimes. This doubt was the shadow which sometimes made a sudden darkness that obscured the sunshine. Happily for Charlotte's true lover, the shadow did not often come between him and the light of those dear eyes which were his pole stars. The December days were shortening as the year drew to its close, and afternoon tea seemed more than ever delightful to Charlotte and her betrothed, now that it could be enjoyed in the mysterious half-light, a glimmer of chill grey day looking coldly in at the unshrouded window, like some ghostly watcher envying these mortals in their happiness, and the red glow of the low fire reflected upon every curve and facet of the shining steel grate. To sit by the fire at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, watching the changeful light upon Charlotte's face, the rosy glow that seemed to linger carelessly on broad low brow and sweet ripe lips, the deep shadows that darkened eyes and hair, was bliss unspeakable for Mr. Hawkehurst. The lovers talked the prettiest nonsense to each other, while Mrs. Sheldon dozed placidly behind the friendly shelter of a banner screen hooked on to the chimney-piece, or conversed with Diana in a monotonous undertone, solemnly debating the relative wisdom of dyeing or turning in relation to a faded silk dress. Upon one special evening, Valentine lingered just a little longer than usual. Christmas was near at hand, and the young man had brought his liege lady tribute in the shape of a bundle of Christmas literature. Tennyson had been laid aside in favour of the genial Christmas fare, which had the one fault, and that came a fortnight before the jovial season, and in a manner forestalled the delights of that time-honoured period, making the season itself seem flat and dull, and turkey and plum-pudding the stalest commodities in the world when they did come. How indeed can a man do full justice to his Aunt Tabitha's plum-pudding, or his Uncle Joe's renowned rum punch, if he has quaffed the steaming bowl with the 7 poor travellers, or eaten his Christmas dinner at the Kiddleawink a fortnight beforehand? Are not the pleasures of life joys as perishable as the bloom on a peach or the freshness of a rose? Valentine had read the ghastliest of ghost stories, and the most humorous of word pictures, for the benefit of the audience in Mrs. Sheldon's drawing-room, and now, after tea, they sat by the fire talking of the ghost story, and discussing that unanswerable question about the possibility of such spiritual appearances, which seems to have been debated ever since the world began. Dr. Johnson believed in ghosts, said Valentine. "Oh, please, spare us Dr. Johnson," cried Charlotte, with serio-comic intensity. "What is it that obliges magazine writers to be perpetually talking about Dr. Johnson? If they must dig up persons from the past, why can't they dig up newer persons than that poor ill-used doctor?" The door opened with a hoarse groan, and Mr. Sheldon came into the room, while Miss Halliday was making her playful protest. She stopped, somewhat confused by that sudden entrance. There is a statue of the Commandant in every house, at whose coming hearts grow cold and lips are suddenly silent. It was the first time that the master of the villa had interrupted one of these friendly afternoon teas, and Mrs. Sheldon and her daughter felt that a domestic crisis was at hand. "How is this?" cried the stockbroker's strong hard voice. "You all seem in the dark." He took a wax match from a little gilt stand on the mantelpiece and lighted 2 flaring lamps. He was the sort of man who is always eager to light the gas when people are sitting in the gloaming, meditative and poetical. He let the broad glare of common sense in upon their foolish musings, and scared away Robin Goodfellow and the fairies by means of the Western Gaslight Company's illuminating medium. The light of those 2 flaring jets of gas revealed Charlotte Halliday looking shyly at the roses on the carpet, and trifling nervously with one of the show books on the table. The same light revealed Valentine Hawkehurst standing by the young lady's chair, and looking at Mr. Sheldon with a boldness of countenance that was almost defiance. Poor Georgy's face peered out from behind her favourite banner screen, looking from one to the other in evident alarm. Diana sat in her accustomed corner, watchful, expectant, awaiting the domestic storm. To the surprise of every one except Mr. Sheldon, there was no storm, not even the lightest breeze that ever blew in domestic hemispheres. The stockbroker saluted his stepdaughter with a friendly nod, and greeted her lover with a significant grin. "How ye do, Hawkehurst?" he said, in his pleasant manner. "It's an age since I've seen you. You were going in for literature, I hear, and a very good thing too, if you can make it pay. I understand there are some fellows who really do make that sort of thing pay. Seen my brother George lately? Yes, I suppose you and George are quite a Damon and what's his name. You're going to dine here to night, of course? I suppose we may go in to dinner at once, Georgy? It's 6:30. Mr. Hawkehurst made some faint pretence of having a particular engagement elsewhere, for, supposing Sheldon to be unconscious, he scorned to profit by that gentleman's ignorance. And then, having faltered his refusal, he looked at Charlotte, and Charlotte's eyes cried "Stay!" as plainly as such lovely eyes can speak. So the end of it was that he stayed and partook of the Sheldonian crimped skate, and the Sheldonian roast beef and tapioca pudding, and tasted some special Moselle, which, out of the kindness of his nature, Mr. Sheldon opened for his stepdaughter's betrothed. After dinner there were oranges and crisp uncompromising biscuits, that made an explosive noise like the breaking of windows whenever any one ventured to tamper with them. Item, a decanter of sherry in a silver stand. Item, a decanter of port, which Mr. Sheldon declared to be something almost too good to be drunk, and to the merits of which Valentine was supremely indifferent. The young man would fain have followed his delight when she accompanied her mamma and Diana into the drawing-room, but Mr. Sheldon detained him. "I want a few words with you, Hawkehurst," he said; and Charlotte's cheeks flamed red as peonies at the sound of this alarming sentence. "You shall go after the ladies presently, and they shall torture that poor little piano to their heart's delight for your edification. I won't detain you many minutes. You had really better try that port." Valentine closed the door upon the departing ladies, and went back to his seat very submissively. If there were any battle to be fought out between him and Philip Sheldon, the sooner the trumpet sounded to arms the better. "His remarkable civility almost inclines me to think that he really does want to get rid of that dear girl," Valentine said to himself as he filled his glass and gravely awaited Mr. Sheldon's pleasure. "Now then, my dear Hawkehurst," began that gentleman, squaring himself in his comfortable armchair, and extending his legs before the cheery fire, "let us have a little friendly chat. I'm not given to beating about the bush, you know, and whatever I have to say, I shall say it in very plain words. In the first place, I hope you have not so poor an opinion of my perceptive faculties as to suppose that I don't see what's going on between you and Miss Lotta yonder." "My dear Mr. Sheldon, Hear what I have to say first, and make your protestations afterwards. You needn't be alarmed. You won't find me quite as bad as the stepmother one reads about in the story books, who puts her stepdaughter into a pie, and all that sort of thing. I suppose stepfathers have been a very estimable class, by the way, as it is the stepmother who always drops in for it in the story books. You'll find me very easy to deal with, Mr. Hawkehurst, always provided that you deal in a fair and honourable manner."
"I have no wish to be underhanded in my dealings," Valentine said boldly, and indeed this was the truth. His inclination prompted him to candour, even with Mr. Sheldon; but that fatal necessity, which is the governing principle of the adventurer's life, obliged him to employ the arts of finesse.
"Good!" cried Mr. Sheldon, in the cheery, pleasant tone of an easy-going man of the world, who was not too worldly to perform a generous action once in a way. "All I ask is frankness. You and Charlotte have fallen in love with one another. Why, I can't imagine, except on the hypothesis that a decent-looking young woman and a decent-looking young man can't meet half a dozen times without beginning to think of Gretna Green or St. George's, Hanover Square. Of course, a marriage with you, look at it from a common sense point of view, would be about the worst thing that could happen to my wife's daughter. She is a very fine girl."
A man of the Sheldonian type would call Aphrodite herself a fine girl.
"And might marry some awfully rich city swell, with vineries and pineries and succession houses at Tulse Hill or Highgate, if I chose to put her in the way of that sort of thing. But then, you see, the worst of it is, a man seldom comes to vineries and pineries at Tulse Hill till he's on the shady side of 40. And as I'm not in favour of mercenary marriages, I don't care to force any of my city connection upon poor Lotta. In the neighbourhood of the Stock Exchange there is no sharper man of business than your humble servant, but I don't care to bring business habits to Bayswater. Long before Lotta left school I had made up my mind never to come between her and her own inclination in the matrimonial line. Therefore, if she truly and honestly loves you, and if you truly and honestly love her, I am not the man to forbid the banns."
"My dear Mr. Sheldon, how shall I ever thank you for this?" cried Valentine, surprised into a belief in the purity of the stockbroker's intention.
"Don't be in a hurry," replied that gentleman coolly. "You haven't heard me out yet. Though I may consent to take the very opposite line of conduct which I might be expected to take as a man of the world, I am not going to allow you and Charlotte to make fools of yourselves. There must be no love in a cottage business, no marrying on nothing a year, and with the expectation that papa and mamma will make up the difference between that and a comfortable income. In plain English, if I consent to receive you as Charlotte's future husband, you and she must consent to wait until you can, to my entire satisfaction, prove yourself in a position to keep a wife."
Valentine sighed doubtfully. "I don't think either Miss Halliday or I are in any unreasonable hurry to begin life together," he said thoughtfully; "but there must be some fixed limit to our probation. I am afraid the waiting will be a very long business, if I am to obtain a position that will satisfy you before I ask my dear girl to share my fate."
"Are your prospects so very black?"
"No, to my mind they seem wonderfully bright. But the earnings of a magazine writer will scarcely come up to your idea of an independence. Just now I am getting about £10 a month. With industry I may stretch that 10 to 20, and with luck I might make the 20 into 30, 40, 50.
A man has only to achieve something like a reputation in order to make a handsome living by his pen."
"I'm very glad to hear that," said Mr. Sheldon; "and when you can fairly demonstrate to me that you are earning £30 a month, you shall have my consent to your marriage with Charlotte, and I will do what I can to give you a fair start in life. I suppose you know that she hasn't a sixpence in the world that she can call her own?"
This was a trying question for Valentine Hawkehurst, and Mr. Sheldon looked at him with a sharp scrutinizing glance as he awaited a reply. The young man flushed crimson, and grew pale again before he spoke. "Yes," he said, "I have long been aware that Miss Halliday has no legal claim on her father's fortune."
"There you have hit the mark," cried Mr. Sheldon. "She has no claim to a sixpence in law, but to an honourable man that is not the question. Poor Halliday's money amounted in all to something like £18,000. That sum passed into my possession when I married my poor friend's widow, who had too much respect for me to hamper my position as a man of business by any legal restraints that would have hindered my making the wisest use of her money. I have used that money, and I need scarcely tell you that I have employed it with considerable advantage to myself and Georgy. I therefore can afford to be generous, and I mean to be so. But the manner in which I do things must be of my own choosing. My own children are dead, and there is no one belonging to me that stands in Miss Halliday's way. When I die she will inherit a handsome fortune, and if she marries with my approval, I shall present her with a very comfortable dowry. I think you will allow that this is fair enough."
"Nothing could be fairer or more generous," replied Valentine with enthusiasm. Mr. Sheldon's agreeable candour had entirely subjugated him. Despite all that George had said to his brother's prejudice, he was ready to believe implicitly in Philip's fair dealing.
"And in return for this I ask something on your part," said Mr. Sheldon. "I want you to give me your promise that you will take no serious step without my knowledge. You won't steal a march upon me. You won't walk off with Charlotte some fine morning and marry her at a registry office, or anything of that kind, eh?"
"I will not," answered Valentine resolutely, with a very unpleasant recollection of his dealings with George Sheldon.
"Give me your hand upon that," cried the stockbroker.
Upon this the two men shook hands, and Valentine's fingers were almost crushed in the cold hard grip of Mr. Sheldon's muscular hand. And now there came upon Valentine's ear the sound of one of Mendelssohn's Lieder ohne Wort, tenderly played by the gentle hands he knew so well. And the lover began to feel that he could no longer sit sipping the stockbroker's port with a hypocritical pretence of appreciation, and roasting himself before the blazing fire, the heat whereof was multiplied to an insufferable degree by grate and fender of reflecting steel. Mr. Sheldon was not slow to perceive his guest's impatience, and having made exactly the impression he wanted to make, was quite willing that the interview should come to an end.
"You had better be off to the drawing room," he said good naturedly. "I see that you are in that stage of the fever in which masculine society is only a bore. You can go and hear Charlotte play, while I read the evening papers and write a few letters. You can let her know that you and I understand each other. Of course we shall see you very often. You'll eat your Christmas turkey with us, and so on, and I shall trust you to your honour for the safe keeping of that promise you made me just now," said Mr. Sheldon. "And I shall keep an uncommonly close watch upon you and the young lady, my friend," added that gentleman, communing with his own thoughts as he crossed the smart little hall, where two Birmingham iron knights in chain armour bestrode their gallant chargers on two small tables of sham malachite. Mr. Sheldon's library was not a very inspiring apartment. His ideas of a sanctum sanctorum did not soar above the commonplace. A decent square room, furnished with plenty of pigeon holes, a neat brass scale for the weighing of letters, a copying press, a waste paper basket, a stout brass mounted office inkstand capable of holding a quart or so of ink, and a post office directory, were all he asked for his hours of leisure and meditation. In a handsome glazed bookcase, opposite his writing table,
appeared a richly bound edition of Waverley's novels, Knight's Shakespeare, Hume and Smollett, Fielding, Goldsmith and Gibbon. But except when Georgy dusted the sacred volumes with her own fair hands, the glass doors of the bookcase were never opened. Mr. Sheldon turned on the gas, seated himself at his comfortable writing table, and took up his pen. A quire of office notepaper, with his city address upon it, lay ready beneath his hand, but he did not begin to write immediately. He sat for some time with his elbows on the table and his chin in his hands, meditating with dark fixed brows. "Can I trust her?" he asked himself. "Is it safe to have her near me, after what she said to me in Fitzgeorge Street? Yes, I think I can trust her, up to a certain point. But beyond that I must be on my guard. She might be more dangerous than a stranger. One thing is quite clear. She must be provided for somehow or other. The question is, whether she is to be provided for in this house or out of it, and whether I can make her serve me as I want to be served." This was the gist of Mr. Sheldon's meditations, but they lasted for some time. The question which he had to settle was an important one, and he was too wise a man not to contemplate a subject from every possible point of sight before arriving at his decision. He took a letter clip from one side of his table, and turned over several open letters in search of some particular document. He came at last to the letter he wanted. It was written on very common notepaper, with brown-looking ink, and the penmanship was evidently that of an uneducated person. But Mr. Sheldon studied its contents with the air of a man who is dealing with no unimportant missive. This was the letter which so deeply interested the stockbroker. "Honoured Sir, this comes hoping that you and your honoured lady are well, as it leaves me though not so strong as I could wish, which is not to be expect at my time of my life. My poor nephew was took with the typhus last Tuesday week, was give over on Thursday, and we have buried him at Kensal Green. Honoured Mr. Sheldon, I have now no home. My poor niece must go out to survive. Luckily there are no children, and the poor girl can get her living as housemaid, which she were in service at Highgate before she married my poor Joseph. Honoured Sir, I am truly sorry to trouble you, but I think for old times you will forgive the liberty of this letter. I would not intrude on you if I had any friend to help me in my old age. Your obedient servant, 17 Little Toddles Yard, Lambeth and Wolper." "No friend to help her in her old age," muttered Mr. Sheldon. "That means that she intends to throw herself upon me for the rest of her life, and to put me to the expense of burying her when she is so obliging as to die. Very pleasant, upon my word. A man has a servant in the days of his poverty, pays her every fraction he owes her in the shape of wages, and wishes her Godspeed when she goes to settle down among her relations. And one fine morning, when he has got into a decent position, she writes to inform him that her nephew is dead, and that she expects him to provide for her forthwith. That is the gist of Mrs. Wolper's letter, and if it were not for one or two considerations, I should be very much inclined to take a business-like view of the case, and refer the lady to her parish. What are poor rates intended for, I should like to know, if a man who pays 4 and 2 in the pound is to be pestered in this sort of way?" And then Mr. Sheldon, having given vent to his vexation by such reflections as these, set himself to examine the matter in another light. "I must manage to keep sweet with Nancy Wolper somehow or other, that's very clear, for a chattering old woman is about as dangerous an enemy as a man can have. I might provide for her decently enough out of doors for something like £1 a week, and that would be a cheap enough way of paying off all old scores, but I'm not quite clear that it would be a safe way. A life of idleness might develop Mrs. Wolper's latent propensity for gossip, and gossip is what I want to avoid. No, that plan won't do." For some moments Mr. Sheldon meditated silently, his brows fixed even more sternly than before. Then he struck his hand suddenly on the morocco-covered table, and uttered his thoughts aloud. "I'll risk it," he said. "She shall come into the house and serve my interests by keeping a sharp watch upon Charlotte Halliday. There shall be no secret marriage between those two. No, my friend Valentine, you may be a very clever fellow, but you are not quite clever enough to steal a march upon me." Having arrived at this conclusion, Mr. Sheldon wrote a few lines to Nancy Woolper, telling her to call upon him at the Lawn. End of Book the Seventh, Part 3. Book the Seventh, Part 4 of Birds of Prey by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5. Mr. Sheldon is Benevolent. Nancy Woolper had lost little of her activity during the 10 years that had gone by since she received her wages from Mr. Sheldon, on his breaking up his establishment in Fitzgeorge Street. Her master had given her the opportunity of remaining in his service, had she so pleased, but Mrs. Woolper was a person of independent, not to say haughty, spirit, and she had preferred to join her small fortunes with those of a nephew, who was about to begin business as a chandler and general dealer in a very small way, rather than to submit herself to the sway of that lady whom she insisted on calling Miss Georgy. "It has been so long since I've been used to a Mrs.," she said, when announcing her decision to Mr. Sheldon. "I doubt if I could do with Miss Georgy's finnickin ways. I should feel tewed like, if she came into the kitchen, worritin' and asking questions. I've been used to my own ways, and I don't suppose I could do with hers." So Nancy departed, to enter on a career of unpaid drudgery in the household of her kinsman, and to lose the last shilling of her small savings in the futile endeavour to sustain the fortunes of the general dealer. His death, following very speedily upon his insolvency, left the poor old soul quite adrift, and in this extremity she had been fain to make her appeal to Mr. Sheldon. His reply came in due course, but not without upwards of a week's delay, during which time Nancy Woolper's spirits sank very low, while a dreary vision of a living grave, called a workhouse, loomed more and more darkly upon her poor old eyes. She had well nigh given up all hope of succour from her old master when the letter came, and she was the more inclined to be grateful for very small help after this interval of suspense. It was not without strong emotion that Mrs. Woolper obeyed her master's summons. She had nursed a hard, cold man of the world whom she was going to see once more after 10 years of severance, and though it was more difficult for her to imagine that Philip Sheldon, the stockbroker, was the same Philip she had carried in her stout arms and hushed upon her breast 40 years ago, than it would have been to fancy the dead who had lived in those days restored to life and walking by her side, still she could not forget that such things had been, and could not refrain from looking at her master with more loving eyes because of that memory. A strange dark cloud had arisen between her and her master's image during the latter part of her service in Fitzgeorge Street, but little by little the cloud had melted away, leaving the familiar image clear and unshadowed as of old. She had suffered her mind to be filled with a suspicion so monstrous that for a time it held her as by some fatal spell. But with reflection came the assurance that this thing could not be. Day by day she saw the man whom she had suspected going about the common business of life, coldly serene of aspect, untroubled of manner, confronting fortune with his head erect, living quietly in the house where he had been wont to live, haunted by no dismal shadows, subject to no dark hours of remorse, no sudden access of despair, always equable, businesslike, and untroubled. And she told herself that such a man could not be guilty of the unutterable horror she had imagined. For a year things had gone thus, and then came the marriage with Mrs. Halliday. Mr. Sheldon went down to Barlingford for the performance of that interesting ceremony, and Nancy Woolper bade farewell to the house in Fitzgeorge Street, and handed the key to the agent, who was to deliver it in due course to Mr. Sheldon's successor. To-day, after a lapse of more than 10 years, Mrs. Woolper sat in the stockbroker's study, facing the scrutinizing gaze of those bright black eyes, which had been familiar to her of old, and which had lost none of their cold glitter in the wear and tear of life. "Then you think you can be of some use in the house, as a kind of overlooker of the other servants, eh, Nancy, to prevent waste, and gadding out of doors, and so on?" asked Mr. Sheldon interrogatively. "Ay, sure I can, Mr. Philip," answered the old woman promptly; "and if I don't save you more money than I cost you, the sooner you turn me out of doors the better. I know what London servants are, and I know their ways, and if Miss Georgy doesn't take to the housekeeping, I know as how things must be hugger-mugger like below stairs, however smart and tidy things may be above." "Mrs. Sheldon knows about as much of housekeeping as a baby," replied Philip, with supreme contempt. "She'll not interfere with you, and if you serve me faithfully—" "That I allers did, Mr. Philip." "Yes, yes, I dare say you did. And I want faithful service in the future as well as in the past. Of course you know that I have a stepdaughter?" "Tom Halliday's little girl, as went to school at Scarborough." "The same. But poor Tom's little girl is now a fine young woman, and a source of considerable anxiety to me. I am bound to say that she is an excellent girl, amiable, obedient, and all that kind of thing, but she is a girl, and I freely confess that I am not learned in the way of girls, and I'm very much inclined to be afraid of them." "As how, sir?" "Well, you see, Nancy, they come home from school with their silly heads all full of romantic stuff, fit for nothing but to read novels and strum upon the piano, and before you know where you are, they fall over head and ears in love with the first decent-looking young man who pays them a compliment. At least that's my experience." "Meaning Miss Halliday, sir?" asked Nancy simply. "Has she fallen in love with some young chap?"
"She has, and with a young chap who is not yet in a position to support a wife. Now, if this girl were my own child, I should decidedly set my face against this marriage; but she is only my stepdaughter. I wash my hands of all responsibility in the matter. Marry the young man you have chosen, my dear, say I. All I ask is that you don't marry him until he can give you a comfortable home." "Very well, papa," says my young lady in her most dutiful manner, and "Very well, sir," says my young gentleman, and they both declare themselves agreeable to any amount of delay, provided the marriage comes off some time between this and doomsday.
"Well, sir?" asked Nancy, rather at a loss to understand why Philip Sheldon, the closest and most reserved of men, should happen to be so confidential to-day.
"Well, Nancy, I want to prevent any underhand work. I know what very limited notions of honour young men are apt to entertain nowadays, and how intensely foolish a boarding school miss can be on occasion. I don't want these young people to run off to Gretna Green some fine morning, or to steal a march upon me by getting married on the sly at some out-of-the-way church, after having invested their united fortunes in the purchase of a special licence. In plain words, I distrust Miss Halliday's lover, and I distrust Miss Halliday's common sense, and I want to have a sensible, sharp-eyed person in the house always on the look-out for any kind of danger, and be able to protect my stepdaughter's interests as well as my own."
"But the young lady's mamma, sir? She would look after her daughter, I suppose?"
"Her mamma is foolishly indulgent, and about as capable of taking care of her daughter as of sitting in Parliament. You remember pretty Georgy Cradock, and you must know what she was, and what she is. Mrs. Sheldon is the same woman as Georgy Cradock, a little older, and a little more plump and rosy, but just as pretty and just as useless."
The interview was prolonged for some little time after this, and it ended in a thorough understanding between Mr. Sheldon and his old servant. Nancy Woolper was to re-enter that gentleman's service, and over and above all ordinary duties, she was to undertake the duty of keeping a close watch upon all the movements of Charlotte Halliday. In plain words, she was to be a spy, a private detective, so far as this young lady was concerned. But Mr. Sheldon was too wise to put his requirements into plain words, knowing that even in the hour of her extremity Nancy Woolper would have refused to fill such an office had she clearly understood the measure of its infamy. Upon the day that followed this interview with Mrs. Woolper, the stockbroker came home from the city an hour or two earlier than his custom, and startled Miss Halliday by appearing in the garden where she was walking alone, looking her brightest and prettiest in her dark winter hat and jacket, and pacing briskly to and fro among the bare frost-bound patches of earth that had once been flower-beds. "I want a few minutes' quiet talk with you, Lotta," said Sheldon. "You'd better come into my study, where we're pretty sure not to be interrupted." The girl blushed crimson as she accepted this request, being assured that Mr. Sheldon was going to discuss her matrimonial engagement. Valentine had told her of that very satisfactory interview in the dining room, and from that time she had been trying to find an opportunity for the acknowledgment of her stepfather's generosity. As yet the occasion had not arisen. She did not know how to frame her thanksgiving, and she shrank shyly from telling Mr. Sheldon how grateful she was to him for the liberality of mind which had distinguished his conduct in this affair. "I really ought to thank him," she said to herself more than once. "I was quite prepared for his doing his uttermost to prevent my marriage with Valentine, and instead of that he volunteers his consent, and even promises to give us a fortune. I am bound to thank him for such generous kindness." Perhaps there is no task more difficult than to offer grateful tribute to a person whom one has been apt to think of with a feeling very near akin to dislike. Ever since her mother's second marriage, Charlotte had striven against an instinctive distaste of Mr. Sheldon's society and an innate distrust of Mr. Sheldon's affectionate regard for herself. But now that he had proved his sincerity in this most important crisis of her life, she awoke all at once to the sense of wrong she had done. "I am always reading the Sermon on the Mount, and yet in my thoughts about Mr. Sheldon I have never been able to remember those words, 'Judge not that ye be not judged.' His kindness touches me to the very heart, and I feel it all the more keenly because of my injustice." She followed her stepfather into the prim little study. There was no fire, and the room was colder than a vault on this bleak December day. Charlotte shivered and drew her jacket more tightly across her chest as she perched herself on one of Mr. Sheldon's shining red morocco chairs. "The room strikes cold," she said, "very, very cold." After this there was a brief pause, during which Mr. Sheldon took some papers from the pocket of his overcoat and arranged them on his desk with an absent manner, as if he were rather deliberating upon what he was going to say than thinking of what he was doing. While he loitered thus, Charlotte found courage to speak. "I wish to thank you, Mr. Sheldon, papa," she said, pronouncing the papa with some slight appearance of effort, in spite of her desire to be grateful. I've been wishing to thank you for the last day or two, only it seems difficult sometimes to express oneself about these things." "I do not deserve or wish for your thanks, my dear. I have only done my duty." "But indeed you do deserve my thanks, and you have them all in sincerity, papa. You have been very, very good to me about Valentine. I thought you would be sure to oppose our marriage on the ground of imprudence, you know, and—" "I do oppose your marriage in the present on the ground of imprudence, and I am only consentient to it in the future on the condition that Mr. Hawkehurst shall have secured a comfortable income by his literary labours. He seems to be clever, and he promises fairly." "Oh, yes, indeed, dear papa," cried the girl, pleased by this meed of praise for her lover. "He is more than clever. I am sure you would say so if you had time to read his article on Madame de Sévigné in the Cheapside." "I dare say it is very good, my dear, but I don't care for Madame de Sévigné." "Or his sketch of Bossuet's career in the Charing Cross." "My dear child, I do not even know who Bossuet was. All I require from Mr. Hawkehurst is, that he shall earn a good income before he takes you away from this house.
You have been accustomed to a certain style of living, and I cannot allow you to encounter a life of poverty."
"But, dear papa, I am not in the least afraid of poverty."
"I dare say not, my dear. You have never been poor," replied Mr. Sheldon coolly. "I don't suppose I am as much afraid of a rattlesnake as the poor wretches who are accustomed to see one swinging by its tail from the branch of any tree any day in the course of their travels. I have only a vague idea that a cobra de capello is an unpleasant customer; but depend upon it, those foreign fellows feel their blood stagnate and turn to ice at the sight of the cold slimy looking monster. Poverty and I travelled the same road once, and I know what the gentleman is. I don't want to meet him again."
Mr. Sheldon lapsed into silence after this. His last words had been spoken to himself rather than to Charlotte, and the thoughts that accompanied them seemed far from pleasant to him. Charlotte sat opposite her stepfather, patiently awaiting his pleasure. She looked at the gaudily bound books behind the glass doors, and wondered whether any one had ever opened any of the volumes. "I should like to read dear Sir Walter's stories once more," she thought. "There never was so sweet a romance as The Bride of Lammermoor, and I cannot imagine that one could ever grow weary of reading it. But to ask Mr. Sheldon for the key of that bookcase would be quite impossible. I think his books must be copies of special editions, not meant to be read. I wonder whether they are real books or only upholsterers' dummies." And then her fancies went vagabondizing off to that little archetype of a cottage on the heights of Wimbledon Common, in which she and Valentine were to live when they were married. She was always furnishing and refurnishing this cottage, building it up and pulling it down, as the caprice of the moment dictated. Now it had bow windows and white stuccoed walls. Now it was Elizabethan. Now the simplest, quaintest, rose embowered cottager's dwelling, with diamond panelled casements, and deep thatch on the old grey roof. This afternoon she amused herself by collecting a small library for Valentine, while waiting Mr. Sheldon's next observation. He was to have all her favourite books, of course, and they were to be bound in the prettiest, most girlish bindings. She could see the dainty volumes, primly ranged on the little carved oak bookcase, which Valentine was to pick up in Wardour Street. She fancied herself walking down that mart of bric-a-brac, arm in arm with her lover, intent on picking up. Ah, what happiness! What dear delight in the thought! And oh, of all the bright dreams we dream, how few are realized upon this earth! Do they find their fulfilment in heaven, those visions of perfect bliss? Mr. Sheldon looked up from his desk at last. Miss Halliday remarked to herself that his face was pale and haggard in the chill wintry sunlight; but she knew how hard and self-denying a life he led in his stern devotion to business, and she was in no manner surprised to see him looking ill. "I want to say a few words to you on a matter of business, Lotta," he began, "and I must ask you to give me all your attention." "I will do so with pleasure, papa, but I'm awfully stupid about business." "I shall do my best to make matters simple. I suppose you know what money your father left, including the sums his life had been insured for?" "Yes, I have heard mamma say it was £18,000. I do so hate the idea of those insurances. It seems like the price of a man's life, doesn't it? I dare say it's a very unbusinesslike way of considering the question, but I cannot bear to think that we got the money by dear papa's death." These remarks were too trivial for Mr. Sheldon's notice. He went on with what he had to say in the cold hard voice that was familiar to his clerks, and to the buyers and sellers of shares and stock who had dealings with him. "Your father left £18,000. That amount was left to your mother without reservation. When she married me, without any settlement, that money became mine, in point of law, mine to squander or make away with as I pleased. You know that I have made good use of that money, and that your mother has no reason to repent her confidence in my honour and honesty. The time has come now in which that honour will be put to a sharper test.
You have no legal claim on so much as a shilling of your father's fortune."
"I know that, Mr. Sheldon," Charlotte cried eagerly, "and Valentine knows also; and believe me, I do not expect—"
"I shall have to settle matters with my own conscience as well as with your expectations, my dear Lotta," Mr. Sheldon said solemnly. "Your father left you unprovided for, but as a man of honour I feel myself bound to take care that you shall not suffer by his want of caution. I have therefore prepared a deed of gift, by which I transfer to you £5,000, now invested in the Unitas Bank shares."
"You're going to give me £5,000?" cried Charlotte, astounded.
"Without reservation."
"You mean to say that you will give me this fortune when I marry, papa?" said Charlotte interrogatively.
"I shall give it to you immediately," replied Mr. Sheldon. "I wish you to be thoroughly independent of me and my pleasure. You will then understand that if I insist upon the prudence of delay, I do so in your interest and not my own. I wish you to feel that if I am a hindrance to your immediate marriage, it is not because I wish to delay the disbursement of your dowry."
"Oh, Mr. Sheldon! Oh, papa, you are more than generous, you are noble! It is not that I care for the money. Oh, believe me, there is no one in the world who could care less for that than I do. But your thoughtful kindness, your generosity, touches me to the very heart. Oh, please let me kiss you, just as if you were my own dear father come back to life to protect and guide me. I have thought you cold and worldly, and I have done you so much wrong." She ran to him and wound her arms about his neck before he could put her off, and lifted up her pretty rosy mouth to his hot dry lips. Her heart was overflowing with generous emotion, her face beamed with a happy smile. She was so pleased to find her mother's husband better than she had thought him. But to her supreme astonishment, he thrust her from him roughly, almost violently, and looking up at his face she saw it darkened by a blacker shadow than she had ever seen upon it before. Anger, terror, pain, remorse, she knew not what, but an expression so horrible that she shrunk from him with a sense of alarm, and went back to her chair, bewildered and trembling. "You frighten me, Mr. Sheldon," she said faintly.
"Not more than you frightened me," answered the stockbroker, walking to the window and taking his stand there, with his face hidden from Charlotte. "I did not know there was so much feeling in me. For God's sake, let us have no sentiment."
"Were you angry with me just now?" asked the girl falteringly, utterly at a loss to comprehend the change in her stepfather's manner.
"No, I was not angry. I am not accustomed to these strong emotions," replied Mr. Sheldon huskily. "I cannot stand them. Pray let us avoid all sentimental discussion. I am anxious to do my duty in a straightforward, businesslike way. I don't want gratitude or fuss. The £5,000 are yours, and I am pleased to find you consider the amount sufficient. And now I have only one small favour to ask of you in return."
"I should be very ungrateful if I refused to do anything you may ask," said Charlotte, who could not help feeling a little chilled and disappointed by Mr. Sheldon's stony rejection of her gratitude.
"The matter is very simple. You are young, and have, in the usual course of things, a long life before you. But you know there is always a but in these cases: a railway accident, a little carelessness in passing your drawing room fire some evening when you are dressed in flimsy gauze or muslin, a fever, a cold, or any of the many dangers that lie in wait for all of us, and our best calculations are falsified. If you were to marry and die childless, that money would go to your husband, and neither your mother nor I could ever touch a sixpence of it. Now, as the money, practically, belongs to your mother, I consider this contingency should be provided against, in her interests as well as in mine. In plain words, I want you to make a will leaving that money to me."
"I am quite ready to do so," replied Charlotte.
"Very good, my dear. I felt assured that you would take a sensible view of the matter. If you marry your dear Mr. Hawkehurst, have a family by and by, we will throw the old will into the fire and make a new one. But in the meantime it's just as well to be on the safe side. You shall go into the city with me to-morrow morning, and shall execute the will at my office. It will be the simplest document possible, as simple as the will made by old Sergeant Crane, in which he disposed of £500,000 of money in half a dozen lines, at the rate of £5,000 per word. After we've settled that little matter, we can arrange the transfer of the shares. The whole affair won't occupy an hour." "I will do whatever you wish," Charlotte said meekly. She was not at all elated by the idea of coming suddenly into possession of £5,000. But she was very much impressed by the new view of Mr. Sheldon's character afforded her by his conduct of to-day; and then her thoughts, constant to one point as the needle to the pole, reverted to her lover, and she began to think of the effect her fortune might have upon his prospects. He might go to the bar; he might work and study in pleasant Temple chambers, with wide area windows overlooking the river, and read law books in the evening at the Wimbledon cottage for a few delightful years, at the end of which he would of course become Lord Chancellor. That he should devote such intellect and consecrate such genius as his to the service of his country's law courts, and not ultimately seat himself on the woolsack, was a contingency not to be imagined by Miss Halliday. Ah, what would not £5,000 buy for him? The cottage expanded into a mansion, the little case of books developed into a library second only to that of Duke d'Aumale. A noble steed awaited at the glass door of the vestibule to convey Mr. Hawkehurst to the Temple, before the minute hand of Mr. Sheldon's stern skeleton clock had passed from one figure to another. So great an adept was this young lady in the art of castle building. "Am I to tell mamma about this conversation?" asked Charlotte pleasantly. "Well, no, I think not," replied Mr. Sheldon thoughtfully. "These family arrangements cannot be kept too quiet. Your mamma is a talking person, you know, Charlotte; and as we don't want every one in this part of Bayswater to know the precise amount of your fortune, we may as well let matters rest as they are. Of course you would not wish Mr. Hawkehurst to be enlightened?" "Why not, papa?" "For several reasons. First and foremost, it must be pleasant to you to be sure that he is thoroughly disinterested. I have told him that you will get something as a gift from me, but he may have implied that the something would be little more than a couple of hundreds to furnish a house. Secondly, it must be remembered that he has been brought up in a bad school, and the best way to make him self-reliant and industrious is to let him think he has nothing but his own industry to depend upon. I have set him a task. When he has accomplished that, he shall have you and your £5,000 to boot. Till then I should strongly advise you to keep this business a secret." "Yes," answered Charlotte meditatively, "I think you are right. It would have been very nice to tell him of your kindness, but I want to be quite sure that he loves me for myself alone, from first to last, without one thought of money." "That is wise," said Mr. Sheldon decisively, and thus ended the interview. Charlotte accompanied her stepfather to the city early next morning, and filled in the blanks in a lithographed form, prepared for the convenience of such testators as, being about to dispose of their property, do not care to employ the services of a legal adviser. The will seemed to Charlotte the simplest possible affair. She bequeathed all her property, real and personal, to Philip Sheldon without reserve. But as her entire fortune consisted of the £5,000 just given her by that gentleman, and as her personal property was comprised in a few pretty dresses and trinkets, and desks and work boxes, she could not very well object to such an arrangement. "Of course mamma would have all my books and caskets and boxes and things," she said thoughtfully; "and I should like Diana Paget to have some of my jewellery, please, Mr. Sheldon. Mamma has plenty, you know." "There is no occasion to talk of that, Charlotte," replied the stockbroker. "This will is only a matter of form." Mr. Sheldon omitted to inform his stepdaughter that the instrument just executed would, upon her wedding day, become so much waste paper, an omission that was not in harmony with the practical and careful habits of that gentleman. "Yes, I know it's only a form," replied Charlotte. "But after making a will, one feels as if one was going to die. At least I do. It seems a kind of preparation for death. I don't wonder people rather dislike doing it."
"It's only foolish people who dislike doing it," said Mr. Sheldon, who was in his most practical mood to-day. "And now we will go and arrange a more agreeable business, the transfer of the shares." After this there was a little commercial juggling, in the form of signing and countersigning, which was quite beyond Charlotte's comprehension, which operation being completed, she was told that she was owner of £5,000 in Unitas Bank shares, and that the dividends accruing from time to time on those shares would be hers to dispose of as she pleased. "The income arising from your capital will be more than you can spend so long as you remain under my roof," said Mr. Sheldon. "I should therefore strongly recommend you to invest your dividends as they arise, and thus increase your capital."
"You are so kind and thoughtful," murmured Charlotte. "I shall always be pleased to take your advice." She was strongly impressed by the kindness of the man her thoughts had wronged. "How difficult it is to understand these reserved, matter-of-fact people," she said to herself. "Because my father does not talk sentiment, I have fancied him hard and worldly, and yet he has proved himself as capable of doing a noble action as if he were the most poetical of mankind." Mrs. Sheldon had been told that Charlotte was going into the city to choose a new watch, wherewith to replace the ill-used little Geneva toy that had been her delight as a schoolgirl; and as Charlotte brought home a neat little English-made chronometer from a renowned emporium in Ludgate Hill, the simple matron accepted this explanation in all good faith. "I'm sure, Lotta, you must confess your stepfather is kindness itself in most matters," said Georgy, after an admiring examination of the new watch. "When I think how kindly he has taken this business about Mr. Hawkehurst, and how disinterested he has proved himself in his ideas about your marriage, I really am inclined to think him the best of men." Georgy said this with an air of triumph. She could not forget that there were people in Barlingford who had said hard things about Philip Sheldon, and had prophesied unutterable miseries for herself and her daughter, as the bitter consequence of the imprudence she had been guilty of in her second marriage. "He has indeed been very good, mamma," Charlotte replied gravely, "and believe me I am truly grateful. He does not like fuss or sentiment, but I hope he knows that I appreciate his kindness."
End of Book the Seventh, Part 4. Book the Seventh, Part 5 of Birds of Prey, by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. Riding the High Horse. Never, in his brightest dreams, had Valentine Hawkehurst imagined the stream of life so fair and sunny a river as it seemed to him now. Fortune had treated him so scurvily for 27 years of his life, only to relent of a sudden and fling all her choicest gifts into his lap. I must be the prince in the fairy tale who begins life as a revolting animal of the rhinoceros family, and ends by marrying the prettiest princess of elfindom, he said to himself gaily, as he paced the broad walks of Kensington Gardens, where the bare trees swung their big black branches in the wintry blast, and the rooks cawed their loudest at close of the brief day. What indeed could this young adventurer demand from benignant fortune above and beyond the blessings she had given him? The favoured suitor of the fairest and brightest woman he had ever looked upon, received by her kindred, admitted to her presence, and only bidden to serve a due apprenticeship before he claimed her as his own for ever. What more could he wish? What further boon could he implore from the fates? Yes, there was one more thing, one thing for which Mr. Hawkehurst pined, while most thankful for his many blessings. He wanted a decent excuse for separating himself completely from Horatio Paget. He wanted to shake himself free from all the associations of his previous existence. He wanted to pass through the waters of Jordan, and to emerge purified, regenerate, leaving his garments on the furthermost side of the river. And with all other things appertaining to the past, he would fain have rid himself of Captain Paget. "Be sure your sin will find you out," mused the young man; "and having found you, be sure that it will stick to you like a leech, if your sin takes the shape of an unprincipled acquaintance, as it does in my case. I may try my hardest to cut the past, but will Horatio Paget let me alone in the future? I doubt it. The bent of that man's genius shows itself in his faculty for living upon other people. He knows that I am beginning to earn money regularly, and has begun to borrow of me already. When I can earn more, he will want to borrow more; and although it is very sweet to work for Charlotte Halliday, it would not be by any means agreeable to slave for my friend Paget. Shall I offer him £1 a week, and ask him to retire into the depths of Wales or Cornwall, amend his ways, and live the life of a repentant hermit? I think I could bring myself to sacrifice the weekly sovereign, if there were any hope that Horatio Paget could cease to be. Horatio Paget, on this side the grave. No, I have the misfortune to be intimately acquainted with the gentleman. When he is in the swim, as he calls it, and is earning money on his own account, he will give himself cosy little dinners and 4 and 6 penny primrose gloves; and when he's down on his luck, he will come whining to me." This was by no means a pleasant idea to Mr. Hawkehurst. In the old days he had been distinguished by all the Bohemian's recklessness, and even more than the Bohemian's generosity in his dealings with friend or companion. But now all was changed. He was no longer reckless. A certain result was demanded from him as the price of Charlotte Halliday's hand, and he set himself to accomplish his allotted task with all due forethought and earnestness of purpose. He had need even to exercise restraint over himself, lest, in his eagerness, he should do too much, and so lay himself prostrate from the ill effects of overwork. So anxious was he to push upon the road whose goal was so fair a temple, so light seemed that labour of love which was performed for the sake of Charlotte. He communed with himself very often on the subject of that troublesome question about Captain Paget. How was he to sever his frail skiff from that rakish privateer? What excuse could he find for renouncing his share in the Omega Street lodgings, and setting up a new home elsewhere? "Policy might prompt me to keep my worthy friend under my eye," he said to himself, "in order that I may be sure there is no underhand work going on between him and Philip Sheldon. But I can scarcely believe that Philip Sheldon has any inkling about the Haygarthian fortune. If he had, he would surely not receive me as Charlotte's suitor. What possible motive could he have for doing so?" This was a question which Mr. Hawkehurst had frequently put to himself, for his confidence in Mr. Sheldon was not of that kind which asks no questions. Even while most anxious to believe in that gentleman's honesty of purpose, he was troubled by occasional twinges of unbelief. During the period which had elapsed since his return from Yorkshire, he had been able to discover nothing of any sinister import from the proceedings of Captain Paget. That gentleman appeared to be still engaged upon the promoting business, although by no means so profitably as heretofore. He went into the city every day, and came home in the evening toil worn and out of spirits. He talked freely of his occupation, how he had done much or done nothing during the day, and Valentine was at a loss to perceive any further ground for the suspicion that had arisen in his mind after the meeting at Ullerton station, and the shuffling of the sanctimonious Goodge with regard to Mrs. Rebecca Haygarth's letters. Mr. Hawkehurst therefore determined upon boldly cutting the knot that tied him to the familiar companion of his wanderings. "I'm tired of watching and suspecting," he said to himself. "If my dear love has a right to this fortune, it will surely come to her; or if it should never come, we can live happily without it. Indeed, for my own part, I am inclined to believe that I should be prouder and happier as the husband of a dowerless wife, than as a prince consort to the heiress of the Haygarths. We have built up such a dear, cheery, unpretentious home for ourselves in our talk of the future, that I doubt if we could share to change it for the stateliest mansion in Kensington Palace Gardens or Belgrave Square. My darling could not be my housekeeper, and make lemon cheesecakes in her own pretty little kitchen, if we lived in Belgrave Square. And how could she stand at one of those great Birmingham ironwork gates in the Palace Gardens to watch me ride away to my work? To a man as deeply in love as Mr. Hawkehurst, the sordid dross which other people prize so highly is apt to become daily more indifferent. A kind of colour blindness comes over the vision of the true lover, and the glittering yellow ore seems only so much vulgar earth, to mean a thing to be regarded by any but the mean of soul. Thus it was that Mr. Hawkehurst relaxed his suspicion of Captain Paget, and neglected his patron and ally of Gray's Inn, much to the annoyance of that gentleman, who tormented the young man with little notes demanding interviews. These interviews had of late been far from agreeable to either of the allies. George Sheldon urged the necessity of an immediate marriage. Valentine declined to act in an underhand manner, after the stockbroker's unexpected generosity. "Generosity!" echoed George Sheldon, when Valentine had given him this point-blank refusal at the close of a stormy argument. "Generosity! My brother Phil's generosity! Egad, that is about the best thing I've heard for the last 10 years. If I please, Mr. Valentine Hawkehurst, I could tell you something about my brother which would enable you to estimate his generosity at its true value. But I don't please, and if you choose to run counter to me and my interests, you must pay the price of your folly. You may think yourself uncommonly lucky if the price isn't a stiff one." "I'm prepared to abide by my decision," answered Valentine. "Miss Halliday without a shilling is so dear to me, that I don't care to commit a dishonourable action in order to secure my share of the fortune she may claim. I turned over a new leaf on the day when I first knew myself possessed of her affection. I don't want to go back to the old leaves." George Sheldon gave himself an impatient shrug. "I have heard of a great many fools," he said, "but I never heard of a fool who would play fast and loose with £100,000, and until to-day I couldn't have believed there was such an animal." Mr. Hawkehurst did not deign to notice this remark. "Do be reasonable, Sheldon," he said. "You ask me to do what my sense of right will permit me to do, and you ask me that which I fully believe to be impossible. I cannot for a moment imagine that any persuasion of mine would induce Charlotte to consent to a secret marriage, after your brother's fair and liberal conduct." "Of course not," cried George, with savage impatience. "That's my brother Phil all over. He is so honourable, so plain and straightforward in all his dealings, that he would get the best of Lucifer himself in a bargain. I tell you, Hawkehurst, you don't know how deep he is, as deep as the bottomless pit, by Jove. His very generosity makes me all the more afraid of him. I don't understand his game. If he consented to your marriage in order to get rid of Charlotte, he would let you marry her off hand; but instead of doing that, he makes conditions which must delay your marriage for years. There is the point that bothers me." "You had better pursue your own course, without any reference to me or my marriage with Miss Halliday," said Valentine. "That is exactly what I must do. I can't leave the Haygarth estate to the mercy of Tom, Dick, and Harry, while you try to earn £30 a month by scribbling for the magazines. I must make my bargain with Philip instead of with you, and I can tell you that you'll be the loser by the transaction." "I don't quite see that." "Perhaps not. You see, you don't quite understand my brother Phil. If this money gets into his hands, be sure some of it will stick to them." "Why should the money get into his hand?" "Because so long as Charlotte Halliday is under his roof, she is, to a certain extent, under his authority. And then I tell you again, there's no calculating the depth of that man. He has thrown dust in your eyes already. He will make that poor girl believe him the most disinterested of mankind." "You can warn her." "Yes, as I have warned you. To what purpose? You are inclined to believe in Phil rather than to believe in me, and you will be so inclined to the end of the chapter.
You remember that man Palmer at Rugley, who used to go to church and take the sacrament?"
"Yes, of course I remember that case. What of him?"
"Why, people believed in him, you know, and thought him a jolly good fellow, up to the time when they discovered that he had poisoned a few of his friends in a quite gentlemanly way."
Mr. Hawkehurst smiled at the irrelevance of this remark. He could not perceive the connection of ideas between Palmer the Rugley poisoner and Philip Sheldon the stockbroker. "That was an extreme case," he said.
"Yes, of course, that was an extreme case," answered George carelessly. "Only it goes far to prove that a man may be gifted with a remarkable genius for throwing dust in the eyes of his fellow creatures."
There was no further disputation between the lawyer and Valentine. George Sheldon began to understand that a secret marriage was not to be accomplished in the present position of affairs.
"I am half inclined to suspect that Phil knows something about that money," he said presently, "and is playing some artful game of his own."
"In that case, your better policy would be to take the initiative," answered Valentine.
"I have no other course."
"And will Charlotte know? Will she know that I have been concerned in this business?" asked Valentine, growing very pale all of a sudden. He was thinking how mean he must appear in Miss Halliday's eyes if she came to understand that he had known her to be John Haygarth's heiress at the time he won from her the sweet confession of her love. "Will she ever believe how pure and true my love has been, if she comes to know this?" he asked himself despairingly, while George Sheldon deliberated in silence for a few moments.
"She need know nothing until the business comes to a head," replied George at last. "You see, there may be no resistance on the part of the Crown lawyers, and in that case Miss Halliday will get her rights after a moderate amount of delay. But if they choose to dispute her claim, it will be quite another thing. Halliday versus the Queen, and so on, with no end of swell. Q.C.'s against us. In the latter case, you'll have to put up all your adventures at Ullerton and Huxter's Cross into an affidavit, and Miss H. must know everything."
"Yes, and then she will think no, I do not believe she can misunderstand me, come what may."
"All doubt and difficulty might be avoided if you would manage a marriage on the quiet offhand," said George.
"I tell you again that I cannot do that, and that, even if it were possible, I would not attempt it."
"So be it. You elect to ride the high horse. Take care that magnificent animal doesn't give you an ugly tumble."
"I can take my chance."
"And I must take my chance against that brother of mine. The winning cards are all in my own hand this time, and it will be uncommonly hard if he gets the best of me."
On this the two gentlemen parted. Valentine went to look at a bachelor's lodging in the neighbourhood of Edgware Road, which he had seen advertised in that morning's Times, and George Sheldon started for Bayswater, where he was always sure of a dinner and a liberal allowance of good wine from the hospitality of his prosperous kinsman. CHAPTER VII. Mr. Sheldon is prudent. Valentine found the apartments near the Edgware Road in every manner eligible. The situation was midway between his reading room in Great Russell Street and the abode of his delight, a half-way house on the road between business and pleasure. The terms were very moderate, the rooms airy and pleasant, so he engaged them forthwith, his tenancy to commence at the end of the following week; and having settled this matter, he went back to Omega Street, bent on dissolving partnership with the Captain in a civil but decided manner. A surprise, and a very agreeable one, awaited him at Chelsea. He found the sitting room strewn with Captain Paget's personal property, and the Captain on his knees before a portmanteau packing.
"You're just in time to give me a hand, Val,"
he said, in his most agreeable manner.
"I begin to find out my age when I put my poor old bones into abnormal attitudes. I dare say packing a trunk or two will only be child's play to you."
"I'll pack half a dozen trunks if you like," replied Valentine. "But what is the meaning of this sudden move? I did not know you were going to leave town."
"Neither did I when you and I breakfasted together. I got an unexpected offer of a very decent position abroad this morning, a kind of agency, that will be much better than the hand-to-mouth business I've been doing lately." What kind of agency, and where?"
"Well, so far as I can make out at present, it is something in the steam navigation way. My headquarters will be at Rouen."
"Rouen? Well, it's a pleasant lively old city enough, and as mediaeval as one of Sir Walter's novels, provided they haven't Haussmannised it by this time. And I'm very glad to hear you have secured a comfortable berth."
"And I'm not sorry to leave England, Yal," answered the Captain in rather a mournful tone.
"Why not?"
"Because I think it's time you and I parted company. Our association begins to be rather disadvantageous to you, Val. We've had our ups and downs together, and we've got on very pleasantly, take it for all in all. But now that you're settling down as a literary man, engaged to that young woman, hand in glove with Philip Sheldon, and so on, I think it's time for me to take myself off. I'm not wanted, and sooner or later I should begin to feel myself in the way."
The Captain grew quite pathetic as he said this, and little pangs of remorse shot through Valentine's heart as he remembered how eager he had been to rid himself of this old man of the mountain. And here was the poor old creature offering to take himself out of the way of his own accord. Influenced by this touch of remorse, Mr. Hawkehurst held out his hand, and grasped that of his comrade and patron. "I hope you may do well in some comfortable kind of business," he said heartily. That adjective "comfortable" was a hasty substitute for the adjective "honest," which had been almost on his lips as he uttered his friendly wish. He was too well disposed to all the world not to feel profound pity for this white-headed old man, who for so many years had eaten the bread of rogues and scoundrels. "Come," he cried cheerily, "I'll take all the packing off your hands, Captain, and we'll eat our last dinner and drink our last bottle of sparkling together at my expense, at any place you please to name."
"Say Blanchard's," replied Horatio Paget. "I like a corner window looking out upon the glare and bustle of Regent Street. It reminds one just a little of the Machandourie and the Boulevard. We'll drink Charlotte's health, Val, in bumpers. She's a charming young person, and I only wish she were an heiress for your sake."
The eyes of the two men met as the Captain said this, and there was a twinkle in the cold grey orbs of that gentleman which had a very unpleasant effect upon Valentine. "What treachery is he engaged in now?" he asked himself. "I know that look in my Horatio's eyes, and I know it always means mischief." George Sheldon made his appearance at the Lawn 5 minutes after his brother came home from the City. He entered the domestic circle in his usual free and easy manner, knowing himself to be endured rather than liked by the two ladies, and to be only tolerated as a necessary evil by the master of the house.
"I've dropped in to eat a chop with you, Phil," he said, "in order to get an hour's comfortable talk after dinner. There's no saying half a dozen consecutive words to you in the City, where your clerks seem to spend their lives bouncing in upon you when you don't want them."
There was very little talk during dinner. Charlotte and her stepfather were thoughtful. Diana was chiefly employed in listening to the sotto voce inanities of Mrs. Sheldon, for whom the girl showed herself admirably patient. Her forbearance and gentleness towards Georgy constituted a kind of penitential sacrifice, by which she hoped to atone for the dark thoughts and bitter feelings that possessed her mind during those miserable hours in which she was obliged to witness the happiness of Charlotte and her lover. George Sheldon devoted himself chiefly to his dinner and a certain dry sherry, which he particularly affected. He was a man who would have dined and enjoyed himself at the table of Judas Iscariot, knowing the banquet to be provided out of the 30 pieces of silver.
"That's as good a pheasant as I ever ate, Phil,"
he said, after winding up with the second leg of the bird in question.
"No, Georgy, no macaroni, thanks. I don't care about kicksaws after a good dinner. Has Hawkehurst dined with you lately, by the way, Phil?"
Charlotte blushed red as the holly berries that decorated the chandelier. It was Christmas Eve, and her own fair hands had helped to bedeck the rooms with festal garlands of evergreen and holly.
"He dines with us to-morrow," replied the stockbroker. "You'll come, I suppose, as usual, George?" "Well, I shall be very glad, if I'm not in the way." Mrs. Sheldon murmured some conventional protestation of the unfailing delight afforded her by George's society. "Of course we're always glad to see you," said Philip in his most genial manner; "and now, if you've anything to say to me about business, the sooner you begin the better. You and the girls needn't stay for dessert, Georgy. Almonds and raisins can't be much of a novelty to you; and as none of you like to take any wine, there's not much to stop for. George and I will come in to tea." The ladies departed, by no means sorry to return to their Berlin wool and piano. Diana took up her work with that saintly patience with which she performed all the duties of her position, and Charlotte seated herself before the piano and began to play little bits of waltzes, and odds and ends of polkas, in a dreamy mood, and with a slurring over of dominant bass notes, which would have been torture to a musician's ear. She was wondering whether Valentine would call that evening, Christmas Eve, a sort of occasion for congratulation of some kind from her lover, she fancied. It was the first Christmas Eve on which she had been engaged. She looked back to the same period last year, and remembered herself sitting in that very room strumming on that very piano, and unconscious that there was such a creature as Valentine Hawkehurst upon this earth. And, strange to say, even in that benighted state she had been tolerably happy. "Now, George," said Mr. Sheldon, when the brothers had filled their glasses and planted their chairs on the opposite sides of the hearthrug, "what is the nature of this business you want to talk about?" "Well, it is a business of considerable importance, in which you are only indirectly concerned. The actual principal in the affair is your stepdaughter, Miss Halliday." "Indeed!" "Yes. You know how you have always ridiculed my fancy for hunting up heirs at law, and all that kind of thing; and you know how I have held on, hoping against hope, starting on a new scent when the old scent failed, and so on." "And you've got a chance at last, eh?" "I believe that I have, and a tolerably good one; and I think you will own that it is rather extraordinary that my first lucky hit should bring luck your way." "That is to say, to my stepdaughter?" remarked Mr. Sheldon, without any appearance of astonishment. "Precisely," said George, somewhat disconcerted by his brother's coolness. "I have lately discovered that Miss Halliday is entitled to a certain sum of money, and I pledged myself to put her in possession of that money on one condition." "And that is?" "That she executes a deed promising to give me half of the amount she may recover by my agency." "Suppose she can recover it without your agency?" "That I defy her to do. She does not even know that she has any claim to the amount in question." "Don't be too sure of that." "Or even supposing she knows nothing, do you think her friends are as ignorant as she is? Do you think me such a very bad man of business as to remain all this time unaware of the fact that my stepdaughter, Charlotte Halliday, is next of kin to the Reverend John Haygarth, who died intestate at Tilford Haven in Kent about a year ago?" This was a cannon shot that almost knocked George Sheldon off his chair; but after that first moment of surprise he gave a sigh, or almost a groan, expressive of resignation. "Egad, Philip Sheldon," he said, "I ought not to be astonished at this, knowing you as well as I do. I must have been a confounded fool not to expect some kind of underhand work from you." "What do you mean by underhand work?" exclaimed Mr. Sheldon. "The same newspapers that were open to you were open to me, and I had better opportunities for tracking my stepdaughter's direct descent from John Haygarth's father." "How did you discover Miss Halliday's descent from Matthew Haygarth?" asked George, very meekly. He was quite crestfallen. He began to feel that his brother would have the upper hand of him in this business as in all other businesses in this world. "That is my secret," replied Mr. Sheldon, with agreeable tranquillity of manner. "You have kept your secrets, and I shall keep mine. Your policy has been the policy of distrust. Mine shall be the same. When you were starting this affair, I offered to go into it with you, to advance whatever money you needed, in a friendly manner. You declined my offer, and chose to go in for the business on your own hook. You have made a very good thing for yourself, no doubt; but you are not quite clever enough to keep me altogether in the dark in a matter which concerns a member of my own family." "Yes," said George, with a sigh,
That's where you hold the winning cards. Miss Halliday is your ace of trumps. Depend upon it, I shall know how to hold my strength in reserve, and when to play my leading trump." "And how to collar my king," muttered George between his set teeth. "Come," exclaimed Philip presently, "we may as well discuss this matter in a friendly spirit. What do you mean to propose?" "I have only one proposition to make," answered the lawyer with decision. "I hold every link of the chain of evidence, without which Miss Halliday might as well be a native of the Fiji Islands, for any claim she can assert to John Haygarth's estate. I am prepared to carry this matter through, but I will only do it on the condition that I receive half the fortune recovered from the Crown by Miss Halliday." "A very moderate demand, upon my word." "I dare say I shall be able to make my bargain with Miss Halliday." "Very likely," replied Mr. Sheldon, "and I shall be able to get that bargain set aside as illegal." "I doubt that. I have a deed of agreement drawn up here which would hold water in any court of equity." And hereupon Mr. Sheldon the younger produced and read aloud one of those dry as dust documents by which the legal business of life is carried on. It was a deed to be executed by Charlotte Halliday, spinster of Bayswater, on the one part, and George Sheldon, solicitor of Gray's Inn, on the other part. And it gave to the said George Sheldon, as securely as any deed can give anything, one half of any property, not now in her possession or control, which the said Charlotte Halliday might obtain by agency of the above mentioned George Sheldon. "And pray, who is to find the costs for this business?" asked the stockbroker. "I don't feel by any means disposed to stake my money on such a hazardous game. Who knows what other descendants of Matthew Haygarth may be playing at hide and seek in the remotest corners of the earth, ready to spring out upon us when we've wasted a small fortune upon law proceedings?" "I shan't ask you to risk your money," replied George with sullen dignity. "I have friends who will back me when they see that agreement executed." "Very well, then. All you have to do is to alter your half share to 1/5, and I will undertake that Miss Halliday shall sign the agreement before the week is out." 1/5! "Yes, my dear George. £20,000 will pay you very handsomely for your trouble. I cannot consent to Miss Halliday ceding more than 1/5. "A fig for your consent. The girl is of age and can act upon her own hook. I shall go to Miss Halliday herself," exclaimed the indignant lawyer. "Oh, no, you won't. You must know the danger of running counter to me in this business. That agreement is all very well, but there is no kind of document more easy to upset if one only goes about it in the right way. Play your own game, and I will upset that agreement as surely as I turn this wine glass bowl downwards." Mr. Sheldon's actions, and Mr. Sheldon's look, expressed a determination which George knew how to estimate by the light of past experience. "It is a hard thing to find you against me, after the manner in which I have toiled and slaved for your stepdaughter's interests." "I am bound to hold my stepdaughter's interests paramount over every consideration." "Yes, paramount over brotherly feeling and all that sort of thing. I say that it is more than hard that you should be against me, considering the special circumstances, and the manner in which I have kept my own counsel." "You will take a fifth share or nothing, George," said Mr. Sheldon, with a threatening contraction of his black brows. "If I have any difficulty in arranging matters with you, I will go into this affair myself and carry it through without your help." "That I defy you to do." "You had better not defy me." "Pray, how much do you expect to get out of Miss Halliday's fortune?" demanded the aggravated George. "That is my business," answered Philip. "And now we had better go into the drawing room for our tea. Oh, by the by, George," he added carelessly, "as Miss Halliday is quite a child in all business matters, she had better be treated like a child. I shall tell her that she has a claim to a certain sum of money, but I shall not tell her what sum. Her disappointment will be less in the event of a failure, if her expectations are not large." "You are always so considerate, my dear Phil," said George with a malignant grin. "May I ask how it is you have taken it into your head to play the benevolent father in the matter of Valentine Hawkehurst and Miss Halliday?" "What can it signify to me whom my stepdaughter marries?" asked Phil coolly. "Of course I wish her well, but I will not have the responsibility of controlling her choice. If this young man suits her, let her marry him." "Especially when he happens to suit you so remarkably well. I think I can understand your tactics, Phil."
"You must understand or misunderstand me, just as you please. And now come to tea."
End of Book the Seventh, Part 5. Book the Seventh, Part 6 of Birds of Prey, by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. Christmas Peace. Valentine Hawkehurst did not make his appearance at the Lawn on Christmas Eve. He devoted that evening to the service of his old ally. He performed all friendly offices for the departing captain, dined with him very pleasantly in Regent Street, and accompanied him to the London Bridge terminus, where he beheld the voyager comfortably seated in a second-class carriage of the night train for Newhaven. Mr. Hawkehurst had seen the captain take a through ticket for Rouen, and he saw the train leave the terminus. This he held to be ocular demonstration of the fact that Captain Paget was really going to the Gallic Manchester. "That sort of customer is so uncommonly slippery," said the young man to himself as he left the station. "Nothing but the evidence of my own eyes would have convinced me of my friend's departure. How pure and fresh the London atmosphere seems now that the perfume of Horatio Paget is out of it! I wonder what he is going to do at Rouen. Very little good, I dare say. But why should I wonder about him or trouble myself about him? He is gone, and I have set myself free from the trammels of the past." The next day was Christmas Day. Mr. Hawkehurst recited scraps of Milton's glorious hymn as he made his morning toilet. He was very happy. It was the first Christmas morning on which he had ever awakened with this sense of supreme happiness, or with the consciousness that the day was brighter, or grander, or more holy than other days. It seemed to him to-day, more than ever, that he was indeed a regenerate creature, purified by the influence of a good woman's love. He looked back at his past existence, and the vision of many Christmas days arose before him. A Christmas in Paris, amidst unutterable rain and mud; a Christmas night spent in roaming the boulevards, and in the consumption of cognac and tobacco at a third-rate café; a Christmas in Germany; more than one Christmas in the Queen's Bench; one especially dreary Christmas in a long bare ward at Whitecross Street. How many varied scenes and changing faces arose before his mental vision associated with that festive time! And yet among them all there was not one on which there shone the faintest glimmer of that holy light which makes the common holiday a sacred season. It was a pleasant thing to breakfast without the society of the brilliant Horatio, whose brilliancy was apt to appear somewhat ghastly at that early period of the morning. It was pleasant to loiter over the meal, now meditating on the happy future, now dipping into a tattered copy of Southey's Doctor, with the consciousness that the winds and waves had by this time wafted Captain Paget to a foreign land. Valentine was to spend the whole of Christmas Day with Charlotte and her kindred. He was to accompany them to a fashionable church in the morning, to walk with them after church, to dine and tell ghost stories in the evening. It was to be his first day as a recognised member of that pleasant family at Bayswater, and in the fulness of his heart he felt affectionately disposed to all his adopted relations, even to Mr. Sheldon, whose very noble conduct had impressed him strongly, in spite of the bitter sneers and covert slanders of George. Charlotte had told her lover that her stepfather was a very generous and disinterested person, and that there was a secret which she would have been glad to tell him, had she not been pledged to hold it inviolate. That would have gone far to place Mr. Sheldon in a very exalted light before the eyes of his future son-in-law. And then Miss Halliday nodded and smiled, and informed her lover, with a joyous little laugh, that he should have a horse to ride,
and an edition of Grote's Grease bound in dark brown calf, with bevelled edges, when they were married, this work being one which the young author had of late languished to possess. "Dear foolish Lotta, I fear there will be new history of Greece, based on new theories, before that time comes," said the lover. "No, indeed, that time will come very soon. See how industriously you work. See how well you succeed. The magazine people will soon give you £30 a month. Or who knows that you may not write some book that will make you suddenly famous like Byron, or the good-natured fat little printer who wrote those long, long, long novels that no one reads nowadays." Influenced by Charlotte's hints about her stepfather, Mr. Hawkehurst's friendly feeling for that gentleman grew stronger, and the sneers and innuendoes of the lawyer ceased to have the smallest power over him. "The man is such a thorough-going schemer himself, that he cannot bring himself to believe in another man's honesty," thought Mr. Hawkehurst, while meditating upon his experience of the two brothers. "So far as I have had any dealings with Philip Sheldon, I have found him straightforward enough. I can imagine no hidden motive for his conduct in relation to Charlotte. The test of his honesty will be a manner in which he is acted upon by Charlotte's position as a claimant of a great fortune. Will he throw me overboard, I wonder? Or will my dear one believe me an adventurer and fortune hunter? Ah, no, 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 I do not think in all the complications of life there could come about a state of events which would cause my Charlotte to doubt me. There is no clairvoyance so unerring as true love." Mr. Hawkehurst had need of such philosophy as this to sustain him in the present crisis of his life. He was blessed with a pure delight which excelled his wildest dreams of happiness, but he was not blessed with any sense of security as to the endurance of that exalted state of bliss. Mr. Sheldon would learn Charlotte's position, would doubtless extort from his brother the history of those researches in which Valentine had been engaged, and then, what then? Alas, hereupon those incalculable dangers and perplexities! Might not the stockbroker, as a man of the world, take a sordid view of the whole transaction, and consider Valentine in the light of a shameless adventurer, who had traded upon his secret knowledge in the hope of securing a rich wife? Might he not reveal all to Charlotte, and attempt to place her lover before her in this most odious aspect? She would not believe him base. Her faith would be unshaken, her love unchanged. But it was odious, it was horrible, to think that her ears should be sullied, her tender heart fluttered by the mere suggestion of such baseness. It was during the Christmas morning sermon that Mr. Hawkehurst permitted his mind to be disturbed by these reflections. He was sitting next to his betrothed, and had the pleasure of contemplating her fair girlish face, with the rosy lips half parted in reverent attention as she looked upward to her pastor. After church there was a walk home to the lawn, and during this rapturous promenade Valentine put away from him all shadow of doubt and fear, and in order to bask in the full sunshine of his Charlotte's presence. Her pretty gloved hand rested confidingly on his arm, and the supreme privilege of carrying a dainty blue silk umbrella with an ivory-bound church service was awarded him. With what pride he accepted the duty of conveying his promised wife over the muddy crossings! Those brief journeys seemed to him in a manner typical of their future lives. She was to travel dry-shod over the miry ways of this world, supported by his strong arm. How fondly he surveyed her toilet, and what a sudden interest he felt in the fashions that had until lately seemed so vulgar and frivolous! "I will never denounce the absurdity of those little bonnets again, Lotta," he cried. "That conglomeration of black velvet and maiden's hair fern is divine. Do you know that in some places they call that fern Maria's hair, and hold it sacred to the mother of him who was born to-day? Do you see there is an artistic fitness in your head-dress? Yes, your bonnet is delicious, darling. And though the diminutive size of that velvet jacket would lead me to suppose you had borrowed it from some juvenile sister, It seems the very garment of all garments best calculated to render you just one hair's breadth nearer perfection than you were made by nature." "Valentine, don't be ridiculous," giggled the young lady. "How can I help being ridiculous? Your presence acts upon my nerves like laughing gas. Ah, do you not know what cares and perplexities I have to make me serious?" "Charlotte," exclaimed the young man with sudden energy, "do you think you could ever come to distrust me?" "Valentine, do I think I shall ever be Queen of England? One thing is quite as likely as the other. My dear angel, if you will only believe in me always, there is no power upon earth that can make us unhappy. Suppose you found yourself suddenly possessed of a great fortune, Charlotte, what would you do with it? I would buy you a library as good as that in the British Museum, and then you would not want to spend the whole of your existence in Great Russell Street. But if you had a great fortune, Lotta, don't you think you would be very much disposed to leave me to plod at my desk in Great Russell Street? Possessed of wealth, you would begin to languish for position, and you would allow Mr. Sheldon to bring you some suitor who could give you a name and rank in a society worthy of an angelic creature with 100,000 pounds or so." "I should do nothing of the kind. I do not care for money. Indeed, I should be almost sorry to be very rich." "Why, dearest?" "Because if I were very rich, we could not live in the cottage at Wimbledon, and I could not make lemon cheesecakes for your dinner." "My own true-hearted darling," cried Valentine, "the taint of worldliness can never touch your pure spirit." They were at the gates of Mr. Sheldon's domain by this time. Diana and Georgy had walked behind the lovers, and had talked a little about the sermon, and a good deal about the bonnets, poor Diana doing her very utmost to feign an interest in the finery that had attracted Mrs. Sheldon's wandering gaze. "Well, I should have thought you couldn't fail to see it," said the elderly lady as they approached the gate. "A leghorn, very small, with holly berries and black ribbon, quite French, you know, and so stylish. I was thinking if I had my Tuscan cleaned and altered, it might—" and here the conversation became general, as the family party entered the drawing room, where Mr. Sheldon was reading his paper by a roaring fire. "Talking about the bonnets as per usual," said the stockbroker. "What an enormous amount of spiritual benefit you women must derive from church going. Consols have fallen another eighth since Tuesday afternoon, George," added Mr. Sheldon, addressing himself to his brother, who was standing on the hearth rug with his elbow on the chimney piece. "Consols are your bonnets, papa," cried Charlotte gaily. "I don't think there is a day upon which you do not talk about their having gone up or down or gone somewhere." After luncheon the lovers went for a walk in Kensington Gardens, with Diana Paget to play propriety. "You will come with us, won't you, dear Di?" pleaded Charlotte. "You've been looking pale and ill lately, and I'm sure a walk will do you good." Valentine seconded his liege lady's request, and the three spent a couple of hours pacing briskly to and fro in the lonelier parts of the garden, leaving the broad walks for the cockneys, who mustered strong upon this seasonable Christmas afternoon. For out of those three that wintry walk was rapture only too fleeting. For the third it was passive endurance. The agonies that had but lately rent Diana's breast when she had seen those two together no longer tortured her. The scorpion sting was beginning to lose its venomous power. She suffered still, but her suffering was softened by resignation. There is a limit to the capacity for pain in every mind. Diana had borne her share of grief. She had, in Homeric phrase, satiated herself with anguish and tears, and to those sharp throes and bitter torments there had succeeded a passive sense of sorrow that was almost peace. "I have lost him," she said to herself. "Life can never bring me much joy, but I should be worse than weak if I spent my existence in the indulgence of my sorrow. I should be one of the vilest wretches upon this earth if I could not teach myself to witness the happiness of my friend without repining." Miss Paget had not arrived at this frame of mind without severe struggles. Many times in the long wakeful nights, in the slow joyless days, she had said to herself, "Peace, peace," when there was no peace. But at last the real peace, the true balm of Gilead, was given in the answer to her prayers, and the weary soul tasted the sweetness of repose. She had wrestled with and had vanquished the demon. To-day, as she walked beside the lovers, and listened to their happy, frivolous talk, she felt like a mother who had seen the man she loved won from her by her own daughter, and who had resigned herself to the ruin of all her hopes for the love of her child. There was more genial laughter and pleasant converse at Mr. Sheldon's dinner table that evening than was usual at the hospitable board, but the stockbroker himself contributed little to the merriment of the party. He was quiet and even thoughtful, and let the talk and laughter go by him without any attempt to take part in it. After dinner he went to his own room, while Valentine and the ladies sat around the fire in the orthodox Christmas manner, and after a good deal of discursive conversation subsided into the telling of ghost stories. George Sheldon sat apart from the circle, turning over the books upon the table, or peering into a stereoscope with an evident sense of weariness. This kind of domestic evening was a manner of life which Mr. Sheldon of Gray's Inn denounced as slow, and he submitted himself to the endurance of it this evening only because he did not know where else to bestow his presence. "I don't think papa cares much about ghost stories, does he, Uncle George?" Charlotte asked, by way of saying something to the gentleman, who seemed so very dreary as he sat yawning over the books and stereoscopes. "I don't suppose he does, my dear." "And do you think he believes in ghosts?" the young lady demanded laughingly. "No, I'm sure he doesn't," replied George very seriously. "Why, how seriously you say that!" cried Charlotte, a little startled by George Sheldon's manner, in which there had been an earnestness not quite warranted by the occasion. "I was thinking of your father, not my brother Phil. He died in Philip's house, you know, and if Philip believed in ghosts, he would scarcely have liked living in that house afterwards, you see, and so on. But he went on living there for a 12-month longer. It seemed just as good as any other house to him, I suppose." Hereupon Georgy dissolved into tears, and told the company how she had fled heartbroken from the house in which her first husband had died immediately after the funeral. "And I'm sure the gentlemanly manner in which your step-papa behaved during all that dreadful time, Charlotte, is beyond all praise," continued the lady, turning to her daughter. "So thoughtful, so kind, so patient. What should I have done if poor Tom's illness had happened in a strange house? I don't know. And I have no doubt that the new doctor, Mr. Burkham, did his duty, though his manner was not as decided as I should have wished." "Mr. Burkham!" cried Valentine. "What Burkham is that? We've a member of the Ragamuffins called Burkham, a surgeon, who does a little in the literary line." "The Mr. Burkham who attended my poor dear husband was a very young man," answered Georgy, "a fair man, with a fresh colour and a hesitating manner. I should have been so much better satisfied if he had been older." "That's the man," said Valentine. "The Burkham I know is fresh-coloured and fair, and cannot be much over 30. "Are you and he particularly intimate?" asked George Sheldon carelessly. "Oh, dear no, not at all. We speak to each other when we happen to meet, that's all. He seems a nice fellow enough, and he evidently hasn't much practice, or he couldn't afford to be a ragamuffin and to write farces. He looks to me exactly the kind of modest, deserving man who ought to succeed, and who so seldom does." This was all that was said about Mr. Burkham, but there was no more talk of ghost stories, and a temporary depression fell upon the little assembly. The memory of her father had always a saddening influence on Charlotte, and it needed many tender sotto voce speeches from Valentine to bring back the smiles to her fair young face. The big electro-plated tea-tray and massive silver teapot made their appearance presently, and immediately after came Mr. Sheldon. "I want to have a little talk with you after tea, Hawkehurst," he said, as he took his own cup from Georgy's hand, and proceeded to imbibe the beverage standing. "If you will come out into the garden and have a cigar, I can say all I have to say in a very few minutes, and then we can come in here for a rubber. Georgy is a very decent player, and my brother George plays as good a hand at whist as any man at the Conservative or the Reform." Valentine's heart sank within him. What could Mr. Sheldon want with a few minutes' talk, if not to revoke his gracious permission of some days before? The permission that had been accorded in ignorance of Charlotte's pecuniary advantages. The young man looked very pale as he went to smoke his cigar in Mr. Sheldon's garden. Charlotte followed him with anxious eyes, and wondered at the sudden gravity of his manner. George Sheldon was also puzzled by his brother's desire for a tête-à-tête. "What new move is Phil going to make?" he asked himself. The two men lit their cigars and got them well under way before Mr. Sheldon began to talk. "When I gave my consent to receive you as Miss Halliday's suitor, my dear Hawkehurst," he said at last, "I told you that I was acting as very few men of the world would act, and I only told you the truth. Since giving you that consent I have made a very startling discovery, and one that places me in quite a new position in regard to this matter." "Indeed." "Yes, Mr. Hawkehurst. I have become aware of the fact that Miss Halliday, the girl whom I thought entirely dependent upon my generosity, is heir at law to a large fortune. You will, of course, perceive how entirely this alters the position of affairs." "I do perceive," Valentine answered earnestly; "but I trust you will believe that I have not the faintest idea of Miss Halliday's position when I asked her to be my wife. As to my love for her, I can scarcely tell you when that began, but I think it must have dated from the first hour in which I saw her, for I can remember no period at which I did not love her." "If I did not believe you superior to any mercenary motives, you would have not been under my roof to day, Mr. Hawkehurst," said the stockbroker with extreme gravity. "The discovery of my stepdaughter's position gives me no pleasure. Her claim to this wealth only increases my responsibility with regard to her, and responsibility is what I would willingly avoid. After all due deliberation, therefore, I have decided that this discovery need make no alteration in your position as Charlotte's future husband. If you were worthy of her when she was without fortune, you are not less worthy now." "Mr. Sheldon," cried Valentine with considerable emotion, "I did not expect so much generosity at your hands." "No," replied the stockbroker, "the popular idea of a business man is not particularly agreeable. I do not, however, pretend to anything like generosity. I wish to take a common sense view of the affair, but not an illiberal one." "You have shown so much generosity of feeling that I can no longer sail under false colours," said Valentine, after a brief pause. "Until a day or two I was bound to secrecy by a promise made to your brother. But his communication of Miss Halliday's rights to you sets me at liberty, and I must tell you that which may possibly cause you to withdraw your confidence." Hereupon Mr. Hawkehurst revealed his share in the researches that had resulted in the discovery of Miss Halliday's claim to a large fortune. He entered into no details. He told Mr. Sheldon only that he had been the chief instrument in bringing about of this important discovery. "I can only repeat what I said just now," he added in conclusion. "I have loved Charlotte Halliday from the beginning of our acquaintance, and I declared myself some days before I discovered her position. I trust this confession will in no wise alter your estimate of me." "It would be a poor return for your candour if I were to doubt your voluntary statement, Hawkehurst," answered the broker. "No, I shall not withdraw my confidence. And if your researches should ultimately lead to the advancement of my stepdaughter, there will be only poetical justice in your profiting more or less by that advancement. In the meantime, we cannot take matters too quietly. I am not a sanguine person, and I know how many hearts have been broken by the High Court of Chancery. This grand discovery of yours may result in nothing but disappointment and waste of money, or it may end as pleasantly as my brother and you seem to expect. All I ask is that poor Charlotte's innocent heart may not be tortured by a small lifetime of suspense. Let her be told nothing that can create hope in the present or disappointment in the future. She appears to be perfectly happy in her present position, and it would be worse than folly to disturb her by vague expectations that may never be realized. She will have to make affidavits and so on by and by, I dare say, and when that time comes she must be told there is some kind of suit pending in which she is concerned.
But she need not be told how nearly that suit concerns her, or the extent of her alleged claim. You see, my dear sir, I have seen so much of this sort of thing, and the misery involved in it, that I may be forgiven if I am cautious." This was putting the whole affair in a new light. Until this moment Valentine had fancied that, the chain of evidence once established, Charlotte's claim had only to be asserted in order to place her in immediate possession of the Haygarth estate. But Mr. Sheldon's cool and matter-of-fact discussion of the subject implied all manner of doubt and difficulty, and the Haygarthian thousands seemed carried away to the most remote and shadowy regions of Chanceryland, as by the waves of some legal ocean. "And you really think it would be better not to tell Charlotte?" "I'm sure of it. If you wish to preserve her from all manner of worry and annoyance, you will take care to keep her in the dark until the affair is settled, supposing it ever should be settled. I have known such an affair to outlast the person interested." "You take a very despondent view of the matter." "I take a practical view of it. My brother George is a monomaniac on the next of kin subject. I cannot quite reconcile myself to the idea of concealing the truth from Charlotte." "That is because you do not know the world as well as I do," answered Mr. Sheldon coolly. "I cannot imagine that the idea of this claim would have any disturbing influence upon her," Valentine argued thoughtfully. "She is the last person in the world to care about money." "Perhaps so; but there is a kind of intoxication in the idea of a large fortune, an intoxication that no woman of Charlotte's age could stand against. Tell her that she has a claim to considerable wealth, and from that moment she will count upon the possession of that wealth, and shape all her plans for the future upon that basis. When I get my fortune I will do this, that, and the other. That is what she will be continually saying to herself. And by, when the affair results in failure, as it very likely will, there will remain a sense of disappointment which will last for a lifetime, and go far to embitter all the ordinary pleasures of her existence." "I am inclined to think you are right," said Valentine after some little deliberation. "My darling girl is perfectly happy as it is. It may be wisest to tell her nothing." "I am quite sure of that," replied Mr. Sheldon. "Of course her being enlightened or not can be in no way material to me. It is a subject upon which I can afford to be entirely disinterested." "I will take your advice, Mr. Sheldon." "So be it. In that case matters will remain in status quo. You will be received in this house as my stepdaughter's future husband, and it is an understood thing that your marriage is not to take place without due consultation with me. I am to have a voice in this business." "Most decidedly. It is only right that you should be deferred to." This brought the interview to a close very pleasantly. The gentlemen went back to the house, and Valentine found himself presently seated at a whist table with the brothers Sheldon and Georgy, who played very well, in a feeble kind of way, holding religiously by all the precepts of Hoyle, and in evident fear of her husband and brother-in-law. Charlotte and Diana played duets while the whist progressed, with orthodox silence and solemnity on the part of the four players. Valentine's eyes wandered very often to the piano, and he was in no wise sorry when the termination of a conquering rubber set him at liberty. He contrived to secure a brief tete-a-tete with Charlotte, while he helped her in the arrangement of the books on the music-stand, and then the shrill chime of the clock on the mantelpiece, and an audible yawn from Philip Sheldon, told him that he must go. "Providence has been very good to us," he said in an undertone as he bade Miss Halliday good night. "Your stepfather's conduct is all that is kind and thoughtful, and there's not a cloud upon our future. Good night, and God bless you, my dearest. I think I shall always consider this my first Christmas Day. I never knew till to-day how sweet and holy this anniversary can be." He walked to Cumberland Gate in company with George Sheldon, who preserved a sulky gravity, which was by no means agreeable. "You have chosen your own course," he said at parting, "and I only hope the result may prove your wisdom. But, as I think I may have remarked before, you don't know my brother Phil as well as I do."
Your brother has behaved in such extreme candour and good feeling toward me, that I would really rather not hear any of your unpleasant innuendoes against him. I hate that "I could, and if I would" style of talk; and while I occupy my present position in your brother's house, I cannot consent to hear anything to his discredit." "That's a very tall animal you've taken to riding lately, my friend Hawkehurst," said George; "and when a man rides the high horse with me, I always let him have the benefit of his monture. You have served yourself without consideration for me, and I shall not trouble myself in the future with any regard for you or your interests. But if harm ever comes to you or yours through my brother Philip, remember that I warned you. Good night." In Charlotte's room the cheery little fire burned late upon that frosty night, while the girl sat in her dressing gown, dreamily brushing her soft brown hair, and meditating upon the superhuman merits and graces in her lover. It was more than an hour after the family had retired, when there came a cautious tapping on Charlotte's door. "It's only I, dear," said a low voice, and before Charlotte could answer, the door was opened, and Diana came in, and went straight to the hearth, by which her friend was sitting. "I am so wakeful to-night, Lotta," she said, "and the light under your door tempted me to come in for a few minutes' chat. My dearest Di, you know how glad I always am to see you." "Yes, dear, I know that you were only too good to me, and I have been so wayward, so ungracious. Oh, Charlotte, I know my coldness has wounded you during the last few months. I have been just a little hurt now and then, dear, when you have seemed not to care for me, or to sympathize with me in all my joys and sorrows. But then it has been selfish of me to expect so much sympathy, and I know that, if your manner is cold, your heart is noble." "No, Lotta, it's not noble. It is a wicked heart." "Diana!" "Yes," said Miss Paget, kneeling by her friend's chair, and speaking with suppressed energy, "it has been a wicked heart, wicked because your happiness has been torture to it." "Diana!" "Oh, my dearest one, do not look at me with those innocent, wondering eyes. You will hate me, perhaps, when you know all. Oh, no, 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 you will not hate. You will pity and forgive me. I love him, dear. He was my companion, my only friend. And there was a time, long ago, before he had ever seen your face, when I fancied that he cared for me, and would get to love me as I loved him, unasked, uncared for. Oh, Charlotte, you can never know what I have suffered. It is not in your nature to comprehend what such a woman as I can suffer. I loved him so dearly. I clung so wickedly, so madly to my old hopes, my old dreams, long after they had become the falsest hopes, the wildest dreams that ever had power over a distracted mind. But, my darling, it is past, and I come to you on this Christmas night to tell you that I have conquered my stubborn heart, and that from this time forward there shall be no cloud between you and me." "Diana, my dear friend, poor girl," cried Charlotte, quite overcome. "You loved him, you as well as I, and I have robbed you of his heart." "No, Charlotte, it was never mine." "You loved him all the time you spoke so harshly of him." "When I seemed most harsh, I loved him most. But do not look at me with such distress in your sweet face, my dear. I tell you that the worst pain is past and gone. The rest is very easy to bear and to outlive. These things do not last for ever, Charlotte, whatever the poets and novelists may tell us. If I have not lived through the worst, I should not be here to-night, with your arm around my neck and his name upon my lips. I have never wished you joy until to-night, Charlotte, and now for the first time I can wish you all good things in honesty and truth. I have conquered myself. I do not say that to me Valentine Hawkehurst can never be quite what other men are. I think that to the end of my life there will be a look in his face, a tone of his voice, that will touch me more deeply than any other look or tone upon earth. But my love for you has overcome my love for him, and there is no hidden thought in my mind to-night, as I sit here at your feet and pray for God's blessing on your choice. My darling Diana, I know not how to thank you, how to express my faith and my love."
I doubt if I am worthy of your love, dear, but with God's help I will be worthy of your trust. And if ever there should come a day in which my love can succour or my devotion serve you, there shall be no lack of either. Listen, dear, there are the Waits playing the sweet Christmas hymn. Do you remember what Shakespeare says about the bird of dawning singing all night long, and how no evil spirit roams abroad at this dear season? So hallowed and so gracious is the time. I have conquered my evil spirit, Lotta, and there shall be peace and true love between us for evermore. Shall there not, dearest friend? And thus ends the story of Diana Paget's girlish love, the love that had grown up in secret, to be put away from her heart in silence, and buried with the dead dreams and fancies that had fostered it. For her to-night the romance of life closed forever. For Charlotte the sweet story was newly begun, and the opening chapters were very pleasant. The mystic volume seemed all delight. Blessed with her lover's devotion, her mother's approval, and even Mr. Sheldon's benign approbation, what more could she ask from Providence? What lurking dangers could she fear? What storm cloud could she perceive upon the sunlit heavens? There was a cloud, no bigger than a man's hand, but the harbinger of tempest and terror. It yet remains to be shown what form that cloud assumed, and from what quarter the tempest came. The history of Charlotte Halliday has grown upon the writer, and the completion of that history, with the fate of John Haygarth's fortune, will be found under the title of Charlotte's Inheritance. End of Book the Seventh, Part 6. Recording by Kirk Ziegler. Voiceovers by Kirk.com. End of Birds of Prey by Mary Elizabeth Braddon.